Chapter 2116. Published at 30th of August, 2023, 12:31 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 2116. Acting cool. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The smile on Lionel's face was one those elders present wished that they could wipe away with a single slap, but whether it was the starship, or due to Eleanor, they knew that such a thing was a pipe dream. But the ask alone wasn't why they were in such a tough situation. They had witnessed Lionel's cunning a long while ago. They had even felt enraged on behalf of their disciples, but when it was suddenly turned on them, they felt even more suffocated. Compared to the revenue of 100 years for a single disciple, a single gold-grade weapon was less than nothing. It might as well be an ant by the side of the road. So, why was there such a disparity in the price? Of course, the heirs were worth a great deal more, but surely it wouldn't be millions of times more, which was the range that they were working with here. The only explanation was that Lionel had done it on purpose. While one gold-grade weapon wasn't worth much, just how many disciples had they sent in? Any who wanted to have even a small chance of winning would have to send tens of millions in. And that was the bare minimum. Those that were like the Tor family that had died early on were still relatively luckier. That was because they had only had a few thousand disciples to start when their road had come to an end. But how could this be the case for them all? Lionel hadn't made a distinction between people he had killed with his own hands, and those that had died at the hands of others either. That meant it was a wide-open opportunity for all of those here. And after the shock that they could be revived subsided, the sinister nature of Lionel's words settled in soon after. This was because of one simple reason. If they saved one, they would have to save them all. No, even further than that. Even if 99 of 100 families refused this deal, just one of them nodding their head would force the hand of the rest. The Tor family, for example, was one such existence that was very likely to agree. Armand was their one heir-level genius that had died. If his partner was taken into account, they would have to exchange 110 years of revenue in addition to a few thousand half-life grade weapons. After all, the first few thousand disciples to be traded for would have been their absolute best. This was a steep price, but it was relatively easier to swallow compared to what the Gamine and Libra families would have to pay, or the Pious and Quarius families after them. This might not sound like a big deal. Just exchange for less people, right? But any patriarch or matriarch who would be willing to make such a decision never deserved their position in the first place. That wasn't because of some sanctimonious moral high ground, but rather because they would be far too stupid. If you traded for some lives but not others, how would their people react? Didn't those geniuses have their own parents? Didn't they have grandparents? Siblings? How would such individuals react to knowing that the family could have revived their loved one for a mere gold-grade weapon, and yet refused to? What was the value of a human life? This was a question that Lionel had been pursuing the answer to for all his life. But right now the answer seemed quite clear. To the right person it was priceless. If these leaders and ancestors wanted their absolute geniuses back, they would have to exchange for everybody, or nobody at all. And if they took the latter option, they would have to hope that no other families took Lionel up on his deal, or else their higher-ups would look both weak and heartless in comparison. That was the reality. Although Lionel was seemingly giving them the option to refuse, the guillotine was already above their heads. His sly smile held all the meaning in the world. They were already caught in his net the moment he had taken action. And now, these families were in a situation where they had no choice but to fund the Morales family's war efforts. And considering the skill that Lionel had displayed, and the special armors he had created that could allow soldiers to share their power amongst one another, this was the worst thing they could do. Lionel smiled and didn't say anything more. He didn't care to waste his breath on these people. He had already given them a way out. He had told them already that anyone he saw would die under his hand. They hadn't believed him. They had thought he was too weak and far too arrogant, and now they were paying the price for it. With a slight nudge, the starship moved forward, the various ancestors having no choice but to move out of the way. Eleanor shook her head when she saw where Lionel was going. Lionel landed on his father's silver boat and unceremoniously threw out a kick. Those in the surroundings were once again stunned, and each of them wore odd expressions. Once again, everything they knew about Velasco's character said that he wouldn't stand for such a thing even by the hands of his own son. As expected, before the kick could land, a shield magically appeared and Lionel's foot was blocked. "You have a lot of nerve disturbing my nap." Velasco's voice boomed like thunder, the various starships in the surroundings tumbling and groaning. Even the protective force art of Lionel's newly acquired starship rumbled and cracked. A shield that should have been immune to the attacks of an ancestor almost fell beneath a single shout. Roelfen diaufas nu omicron viepsilinel omicronem, everyone's expression changed once again. However, Lionel's next words made them choke. "Are you done yet, old man? Give it up. Your beautifully sculpted image has been tarnished." "I mean, I could tarnish it a little bit more if I revealed what was in dash." Velasco suddenly scrambled to get up. Chapter 21:17. Published at 30th of August, 2023, 12:31 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 21:17. Degenerate. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's next words were covered by Velasco's hand. The latter looked like he had a fiery rage in his gaze, but before he could do anything more, Eleanor landed silently by Lionel's side, throwing up an eyebrow. "Reveal what exactly?" Lionel sent his mother a helpless glance, as though to say that his mouth had been sealed by the criminal before him. He was helpless to do anything before this kind of power. How could he continue to explain? "Nothing, dear. This little rascal is just making things up," Velasco hurried to explain. "Is that so?" Eleanor said lightly. "Interesting." Velasco coughed, trying to regain his dignified bearing. He sent another glare Lionel's way, but the latter seemed to have been consumed by his amusement. His father had a fascination with anime during his time on Earth. Just like any self-respecting weeb, he had fallen down his own rabbit holes and ended up basking in the degenerate side of the culture. That poor man, within his wife by his side for a whole 17 years, he fell into complete depravity. He was a reformed playboy, but his libido hadn't magically vanished. It was impossible for Lionel to find something that Velasco wanted to hide normally, but the trouble was that Earth had very strict rules before the metamorphosis. Such content had very strict bans on them, and the methods by which one could get their hands on them was very long and grueling. Of course, Velasco didn't fear the punishment of the people on Earth, but the trouble was that in order to partake in that culture, one had to use the systems of Earth, obviously. That meant that he had to use the same devices as everyone else. Velasco's main focus on Earth originally was taking in their knowledge about healing the body. Earth might have been primitive at the time, but they were unmatched in talent, and when it came to curing the ailments faced by third-dimensional existences, it probably wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that they had become number one. Velasco was originally a crafter. He didn't know anything about biology initially, and because he was so focused on the biological side of things, his tech savviness lagged behind. In such a situation, an old man with minimal knowledge or care, faced with a youth of the younger generation who knew the ins and outs of such devices, he never stood a chance. It also didn't help that Velasco was arrogant and felt that everything was beneath his notice. It only took a single slip-up and Lionel had grasped his weakness. Originally, Velasco had already wiped this memory from Lionel, but after Lionel's dream force had reached a certain standard, he was even able to remember his mother's face, let alone this. Thinking to this point, Lionel's grin only grew wider and wider. Seeing that his wife was now ignoring him, Velasco really wanted to shake this son of his until he couldn't see straight anymore. If before Lionel had already tarnished his well-earned reputation, it had all come crumbling down now. Roelfen diaufas nu omicron viepsilinel omicronem, Eleanor, baby, it's not like that really. Velasco let go of Lionel and moved toward Eleanor. However, he knew it was helpless. Eleanor wouldn't talk to him until he explained what Lionel had wanted to say, and knowing her character, she wouldn't let Lionel tell her. She would want to hear it from Velasco himself, making it even more embarrassing. How could he say such a thing out loud? "I was just speaking nonsense, Mom. You don't need to worry about it," Lionel said slyly. "You." Velasco nearly cut Lionel's tongue out. Saying such a thing only made it worse. This son of his was more than smart enough to know that. He had definitely said it on purpose. Lionel started to laugh hard. So hard that he couldn't even breathe properly. This was what his father got for trying to act cool. Lionel seemed to be having the time of his life. It didn't look like he had just fought a life and death battle at all. All of his gloominess had vanished. He felt that life wasn't so bad right now. He looked toward Aina's side profile. She still rested on his back, lost in a deep sleep. Yeah, life wasn't so bad right now. The rest of the human domain weren't quite sure what they were looking at. Seeing the kind of relationship that Lionel had with his father, and that Lionel truly dared to tease him to this extent, they realized how foolish it was to try and separate Lionel's death from Velasco by using the younger generation. They had thought that no matter how in love Velasco was with Eleanor, when it came to his own bottom line, he wouldn't cross it no matter what. There were many relationships like this where the man would take the docile position, until it came to a matter that he had a stern position on. That was why they weren't too worried about Eleanor pressuring Velasco into taking action. But now, it seemed that maybe all this time Velasco's love for Lionel was a bit too understated, and maybe that had been done on purpose by Velasco to force his son to grow without his shadow and looming presence. And the results were all too clear. Between Amory, who had been protected from birth, and Lionel, which one of them was better? They didn't believe that Lionel was so much more talented than Amory. The gap between them lay between what they had experienced to reach this point. The Morales ancestors looked quite gratified. For a long while Velasco, despite being one of the Nebula generation, was practically a separate entity from the Morales due to his independence. But now, it felt like the human domain had been reminded of where his roots truly lay, and it was ironically due to his son. It seems that we'll need to prepare for a grand coronation ceremony, Ancestor Alvaro said with a bright smile. However, at that moment, their expressions all seemed to change at once. Chapter 2118. Published at 30th of August, 2023, 12:31 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 2118. Unity. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The rumbling of the human domain wasn't something that could be ignored. It was a trembling that originated in the depths of space, as though a monstrous existence had grabbed hold of the folds of reality and began to whip it about. There was only one thing that could cause this, and that was a large change in the domain barrier. The domain barrier wasn't much of a barrier. It was instead the very void battlefield that Lionel had been to once before. The trouble was that the deeper one ventured into the void battlefield, the thicker that anarchic force would become. At a certain point, it would thicken to the extent that even ancestors would find it difficult to make their way through while maintaining their lives. It was possible to make it through, but it required a great deal of effort. This process usually required a large amount of force that scaled depending on the number of individuals that were being transported through. Lionel had been to a Raypax nest before, but that Raypax nest was located in human territory, on their side of the barrier. It was just unfortunate on the part of the Raypax that their once-in-generation genius happened to be born there. But this was due to the fact that Raypax were particularly war-hungry. They spent the majority of their lives on the battlefield, and many joked that the Raypax domain was probably empty, because the rest of them were all fighting domain battles on the void battlefield. This aside, the point in mentioning this was that movement through the barrier was infrequent, but it wasn't rare, so many were used to it. However, for the commotion to be this large, it could only mean that an impossible number of enemies were storming through all at once, possibly even from multiple domains at once. When those present thought to this point, their hearts lurched into their throats. Suddenly, the reason settled in for them all. All this time, those races had mostly left the humans alone because they didn't have any land worth conquering. For those monstrous races, they had too many seventh-dimensional worlds to care about waging war to get more. All they cared about were eighth-dimensional worlds. If they could claim a few human territories with ease, they would take some, which was why there were still other races on the void battlefield. But if it took too much effort to the point of not being worth it, they wouldn't bother. But now, everyone looked toward the Morales. This had all happened even faster than they had expected. The sudden breakthrough had caught them all off guard. They were ready for Earth to promote in the next coming years, but no one had been ready for the Morales to do it first. It had to be remembered that the Morales world only had seventh-dimensional potential to begin with. If not for the sudden formation of their constellation, all of this wouldn't have happened. Many wanted to blame the Morales. They were already enraged with them as it was due to Lionel, but what could they do in this matter? At best, they could use it as an excuse to try and force the Morales to take on the most difficult missions. But after they had this thought, they couldn't help but take a look toward Velasco, who was still trying to appease his wife as though he couldn't feel the commotion at all. In fact, his silver boat was surprisingly sturdy in the roaring waves of space. They hesitated and grit their teeth. The Void Palace was the front line, but they knew that they would have to act to help soon. The strongest of the human families were surprisingly unselfish in this matter, as they were well aware that if things went wrong, it would be they who were finished. Like this, many of the starships vanished into the horizon. Many swept another glance toward Lionel, but seeing that it was absent-minded, they felt that the warning in their glares fell on blind eyes. He simply didn't seem to care. Soon, only the Morales were left, but they realized the seriousness of the situation as well. It was unknown how long the Void Palace disciples would be able to last. There was no doubt that the domain-ranked disciples would take action now, as this was their main purpose, but many of them were out on missions, and it was hard to tell how organized they would be. This matter dampened their mood considerably. Those that were sharp knew how much this matter would influence the Morales' place in this war. It was one thing for Earth, which was perceived to have little power of its own, to trigger this war, but for it to be them, as one of the apex families of the human domain, to do so, it had a completely different connotation. Little Nova, it seems that your coronation will have to be put on hold, but for all intents and purposes, you are the patriarch of the Morales family now, Ancestor Alvaro said lightly. Suddenly, a rare female ancestor among them stepped forward. Indeed, Little Nova is now our patriarch, but isn't it about time that you release Third Nova? The air wars are over, and any grudge you two have had during them should be over now. Ancestor Alvaro subconsciously nodded. Indeed, those were the rules of the air wars. It kept the peace in the family. And since a domain war was about to be waged with the human domain being assaulted from all sides, unity was more important now than ever. The female ancestor went by Ancestor Isa. She had a petite frame and was getting on in her middle ages, but she still had a youthful, sharp look in her eyes. Female ancestors were quite rare among the Morales, because the metal synergy lineage factor wasn't particularly suited to them. However, Ancestor Isa was one of the rare few women who had been an heir candidate in the past, although she hadn't won. Lionel sent a calm gaze toward the ancestors. Indeed, to these old fogies, the patriarch position was only the figurehead of the family. The true authority rested on their shoulders. This could be seen by the dissatisfaction even the impartial Ancestor Alvaro had felt when he thought that Lionel was ordering him to capture Richard. But how could Lionel release Third Nova so easily? Second Nova frowned. He knew that Lionel knew something, but if he took too firm of a stance without evidence, it would cause far more harm than good. He knew that Lionel was a bit hard-headed, but at the same time he believed that Lionel wasn't a fool either. It was hard to tell how he would approach this situation. Just when Lionel was about to respond, a dashing streak of golden light came from the distance, and it unfurled into a long, white gold scroll. The expressions of the ancestors changed once more. This scroll, it was the fastest communication method the Void Palace had access to. They thought it was fine at first, just alerting them to what they already knew, but the actual news shook them to their core. It only had one line. The first line has been breached. The human domain of the Void battlefield only had 3 main lines of defense, and in just a few moments, the first had already been charged through. This matter was impossible to understate. The domain-ranked disciples they had thought could hold on for at least some time had already fallen into chaos. Chapter 2119. Published at 30th of August, 2023, 12:31 and 43 seconds p.m. Chapter 2119. Complex feelings. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The ancestors were all shaken. No matter how fast the others invaded, they believed that the Void Palace should at least be able to hold on for a few days, at least 2 or 3 on their own. In the best-case scenario, and if the other races had reservations of their own, even a few weeks wouldn't be impossible. It couldn't be forgotten that the Void Palace was the protector of humanity against foreign races. They weren't just a random power, It could be said that if they weren't neutral, they would be the strongest power in the whole of the human domain. For them to have already lost a line of defense was ridiculous. But then it hit them like a ton of bricks. To Lionel, the matters of the Cataclysm Zone were only less than a year ago, but to the people of the human domain, it was over 20 years ago, and much of those matters had already long since settled down. Even for these ancestors who had experienced so much life, 20 years was definitely not a short time by any stretch. It had made them neglect a fact. The current Void Palace wasn't the same Void Palace of the past. Not everyone had made it out of the Cataclysm Zone. In fact, the casualties were heavy. It had to be remembered that just a normal beast Lionel came across had almost taken his life, and before he left, he could already be considered to be better than most galaxy-ranked disciples. If just a single beast had put Lionel in that position, let alone the strength of that small village he had run into, what chance did many of the others stand? But this was something that should only affect the disciples at and below the galaxy rank, right? Unfortunately, this wasn't even remotely the case. After adjusting themselves, many had concluded what Lionel had. A rampaging zone had trapped them all, and now they would suffer the same fate as others that had failed to clear subdimensional zones. As such, many had thought that they would have to adjust themselves and live out the rest of their lives in this place. They had tried to contact civilization, to become a part of their cities, and their culture. But just how many would have died in such an environment? Lionel had only spent one day in a city, before he practically became a slave to a noble family. The outcomes for the others would have been even worse. Many wouldn't have even been able to make it to the city. They would have died in the forest before reaching it. They would have died at the hands of the villagers who couldn't enter the cities. And even if they made it to the city, they would have fallen from the chain bridge before they could cross it. This was the cruel reality. Many didn't even have spectacular deaths. Some even spawned directly into demon territory, and were shredded to pieces by monsters one would only see in nightmares. The true weight of the lives lost was hard to quantify only because those that had survived had come back in such a trickle, so many could hope that the rest were still on their way. However, with Lionel's return, that hope was dashed. But the Void Palace had taken advantage of the lag to not promote their losses, as it would shake the human domain's resolve in their abilities. But now they were seeing those effects firsthand. It didn't matter if they tried to control it now. The Void Palace wasn't even 50% as powerful as it used to be. Many Void Elders had died. Many domain-ranked disciples vanished never to be seen again. And even more disciples beneath the domain rank that had died couldn't even be counted in numbers that could be visualized. This delayed onset of the severity of the matter hit much harder than if they had been fully prepared. Lionel stood in silence, watching the reactions of the ancestors carefully. He had already guessed that this matter would happen, but even he was caught off guard by the sudden promotion of the Moralis territory to the 8th dimension. That said, he had been prepared for a war to break out the instant the air wars erupted. It was just that this was a much different war than the one he had been waiting for. Even so, war, was it not? Lionel reached out a hand and suddenly snapped his fingers. His second starship, the much larger of the two, rumbled as the sound echoed. Under the shocked gazes of those present, the skies suddenly began to ripple. One warrior after another appeared. At first, there were only thousands, but then there were tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions, then tens of millions. By the time they had all appeared, there were billions of them. And somehow, the ancestors didn't sense them until Lionel had snapped his fingers. "Board the ship," Lionel commanded coolly. The billions of troops filed onto the starship. Despite their numbers, the starship didn't even begin to show any signs of being overloaded. In fact, it could probably house 10 times more warriors with absolute ease. The Moralis ancestors looked toward Lionel with an incredulous gaze. "The rewards for winning the air wars, can I have them please?" Lionel turned toward Ancestor Hito and asked. Before Ancestor Issa could bring up her request again, Ancestor Hito actually waved a hand. The Moralis weren't easy to force into a corner. Long before the air wars began, they had already forced those families to hand over the rewards. That way it would be impossible to back out in the final moment. Lionel caught the spatial ring. "If you want to use the Moralis pools, you'll have to go there though. Ancestor Hito said amiably. Lionel smiled. There'll be plenty of time. For now, I'm more eager to slaughter those that want to stand on my land. The gaze of the Morales family flashed. Chapter 2120. Published at 31st of August, 2023, 6:43 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 2120. On par. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Mom, old man, are you two coming with me? Velasco, who was still trying to appease Eleanor, snorted. Why would I stand on such a shabby ship? Do I look like a beggar to you? The Morales ancestors couldn't help but wear weird expressions. Velasco sounded much less overbearing than he usually did. He sounded more like a big brother teasing his little brother. They found it hard to believe, but indeed, the relationship between Lionel and Velasco wasn't as it had seemed. Of course Mom will come with you, Eleanor said immediately as though Velasco hadn't spoken at all. Velasco was speechless, but as the starship vanished into the distance, he could only climb into his own silver boat and follow behind, mumbling something to himself. The Morales ancestors watched in silence, their feelings complicated. This Lionel was somehow both very much like his father and very different. They were both supremely arrogant, but while Velasco didn't care to accumulate power, believing that he himself alone was enough, Lionel was different. He had supporters, he was more than willing to leverage his bloodline to command their resources, and he even had no qualms about being shameless and relying on the support of others. In a way, Lionel was even more dangerous than his father was. Just as talented, but less restricted by his own personality and demeanor. Seeing him take out billions of soldiers this way, right after the youths had already put everything they could into the air wars, was baffling. Though most of them were older than 100 years old, there were definitely a large number that weren't, and yet he didn't even care to use them. That was because his goal had never been the air wars in the first place. From the beginning, his vision was beyond that, and it seemed to be that he didn't care whether the Morales fully supported him or not. The former heir candidates looked toward one another silently, but the ancestors were the ones who really didn't know how to deal with this matter. Lionel couldn't be controlled, he couldn't be constrained. It was difficult to tell just what would happen to the Morales family under his control. In fact, it seemed that their usual traditions were in jeopardy. They had just been really happy, but they weren't sure now. When it came time for the next generation to take up the patriarch position, would Lionel willingly step down as all the others before him had? His ambition didn't seem to allow for this. There had been one other time this happened in Morales history, and it had caused divisions that lasted until this day. Could they allow it to happen again? The ancestors looked toward one another, their expressions unreadable. How could they remove Lionel from the patriarch position after all that had happened? Maybe even some of the ancestors wouldn't agree. How would the human domain react to such a farce? And further than that, what kind of retaliation would Lionel give them? Lionel could guess the thoughts of the ancestors. The funny part was that they were right to worry, because he truly had no intention of stepping down. He truly had a knack for getting himself into trouble he deserved, but he didn't care very much. By the time it was time for him to step down, he would have already united at least the human domain. It would no longer be the Morales family, it would be an empire. If the Morales tried to kick him out ahead of time, well, good luck. Lionel spun the spatial ring he had received in his finger, before he forgot everything around him to send his mind into it. He didn't have as much time as he thought he would, so if he wanted to maximize these resources, he would have a very short time. The silver tablet only worked on those below the 8th dimension. He couldn't just use it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. And even when it came to using it on 7th dimensional experts and lower, there were limits, or else he wouldn't have had to purge the souls that had remained from the trial. Relying on just being able to revive everyone would only get him so far. He needed real power. He had prepared a great deal already, but in his opinion, there was no such thing as too much preparation. These resources were rare, and he couldn't easily get his hands on them. They represented the accumulation of the most powerful families of the human domain. He would be a fool to not try and make use of it immediately. With the help of the suspended reality pods of the segmented cube, he could extend this next day into almost 100 days. He had only displayed 1,000 pods during the Air Wars, but that was only so that others would be fooled into thinking it couldn't be scaled. In reality, he had 1,000,000. This was enough to fundamentally change an already elite troop. Lionel didn't edge himself. He moved his mind directly to the most powerful treasures, or rather, what he assumed to be the most powerful, the Suyard family, the Omen family, and the spiritual religion. It had to be remembered that the treasure they were trying to match up to was the transcendent pool of the Moralis. This allowed someone with no training to enter the seventh dimension of the conventional path in just one day. The Moralis wouldn't let those families bring out anything weaker than that. Of course, the resource itself wouldn't be given to Lionel. That would be ridiculous. But the amount necessary to use it once would be. To most, a quantity of one for an army of billions was far too little. But Lionel had his own thoughts. His mind landed upon the Suyard family's treasure, and his eyes narrowed. Indeed, it seemed that the Suyard family was worthy of being on par with the Moralis family. Chapter 2121. Published at 31st of August, 2023, 6:43 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 2121. Boost. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took out a stone. It was only as large as his palm, but its heft almost caused the back of his hand to hit the ground. This might not be too surprising if it was others, but Lionel's raw strength now had almost caught up with Aina's before she broke into the seventh dimension. His future wife was practically a dinosaur in the body of a lovely woman, so this metric alone was enough to paint just how powerful Lionel was. The fact this stone was so heavy, though, only surprised Lionel further. That was because he could somewhat already guess what it could do. This stone was designed to train weapon forces. One would sink their weapon force into the stone and in return, it would be shattered. This process would be fed back to the individual using the stone, and the weaknesses of one's weapon force would be reflected to them. This was a truly magical thing. If Lionel had seen such an item back in the Cataclysm Zone, he would have definitely taken it for himself even at the cost of giving up the other things that he had exchanged for. Lionel didn't know how useful it would be for him since he had already formed a sovereign spear force, but if he was correct, this sort of stone should be one of the best that the Suyard had access to. Depending on the talent of the person that was using it, helping them to form true sovereign weapon force wasn't impossible. The Suyard family simply called it the whetstone, an apt name for its function. Lionel hesitated. While he was curious to see if he could lower the required strikes to display fourth-layered spear force, he didn't act immediately. After his recent increase in dream force, he had gone from needing almost 1,000 strikes to only 333. If he used this stone, he might be able to lower it further. If he could lower the requirement to just 100, he could probably use it for longer periods of time in battle. But there was also the chance that the stone would be useless on him. After analyzing the stone on its own, Lionel realized that there was actually a small introduction to the treasure. This made sense. The Moralis would obviously force the families, pressuring them to teach them how to use their treasures as well. After all, many of these were top secret and very few outside the top echelon of the families would know everything about them. I see. According to the introduction, this whetstone was able to do one of two things depending on the focus of the user. The first was to allow one to comprehend universal weapon force. The second was to increase the base power of one's weapon force itself. There were various grades of whetstones just like there were various grades of Moralis pools as well. However, this was the highest transcendent whetstone, so there was no need to consider anything else. The only requirement to use the stone was that you had already formed your weapon force. After that, the result was based on one's talent. That said, according to the introduction, even those with the weakest of affinities, assuming they started with third-dimensional weapon force, could increase their weapon force to the fifth dimension at worst. Of course, the benefit would be lesser depending on where one began, but so long as you were below the fifth dimension, you would be guaranteed to form a weapon force 2 dimensions above. If you had a fifth-dimensional weapon force, however, you wouldn't be guaranteed anything if you had poor talent. This logic was the same for universal weapon force. Someone in the Four Seasons realm could instantly comprehend the heavenly body realm, but anything above wasn't guaranteed. These effects seemed lackluster compared to the Moralis pool, allowing one to enter the seventh dimension of the conventional path instantly, but this wasn't the case. This was almost akin to increasing one's affinity for a force instantaneously. It was much more complex than just increasing the strength of one's body. Even so, Lionel frowned. After a long while, he made a decision. Emna. Lionel's voice echoed, and it drifted to one particular beauty. At the moment, Emna, even while seated in silence, felt like an unsheathed blade. But her aura was far too obvious. Emna was the only one of Lionel's subordinates that Lionel felt stood firmly shoulder to shoulder with him and Aina. Her talent was that extraordinary. If not for wanting to keep her as a trump card as well, she would have displayed far more strength during the air wars. Lionel couldn't imagine what would happen to her strength if she managed to become a true blade sovereign. Lionel had wanted to give her the sword domain ring, but then he realized that he was too naive. The sword and the blade were two wholly different disciplines. It wouldn't help Emna, it would hinder her. So, instead he would give her this opportunity instead. If there was a blade domain ring out there, she would definitely be the one to receive it. Emna appeared before Lionel in a streak of sharp light, even leaving a faint white mark on the solid surface. Caught off guard, she caught the stone Lionel thrust at her. Lionel explained things simply and concisely. Then he began to describe force manipulation to her, and gave her a few pointers on what to focus on while using the stone. Then he let her go. Whether she could become a true blade sovereign or not would be up to her. Lionel had succeeded in becoming a true bow sovereign without a domain ring, so he was certain that it was possible. He turned his attention toward his other rewards. He didn't regret not being able to use the whetstone. In fact, even if he didn't have fate with any of these treasures, he would still grin ear to ear, because that would mean he had given each one of his subordinates a huge boost. Chapter 21-22. Published at 31st of August, 2023, 6:43 a.m. Chapter 21-22. Ping if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel took out the Omen family treasure, and he was surprised. He had been certain that it would have some relation to crafting, maybe something that would help flame spirits evolve, or maybe a spirit of a different kind since the Morales had a monopoly on metal spirits, but it was nothing of the sort. The Omen family actually has such a treasure related to combat? Why are they so weak then? In Lionel's palm lay a bronze disc. It had a slight taper to it that didn't allow it to sit on Lionel's palm perfectly. Its outer edge was a separate mechanism from the inner, the outer being layered with complex runes while the interior was perfectly smooth. This was yet another surprise because Lionel had been expecting a consumable item, but then it clicked for Lionel. Given the plans the Omen had for the air wars, would they even consider the possibility of losing? They were very weak overall outside of their crafting abilities, and it could be said that Cynthia's appearance and her high combat strength was an anomaly of their family. As such, they didn't invest in large consumable products like the Seward family's whetstone or the Morales family's pools. At the same time, the items they had that could help spirits evolve were the greatest secrets of their family. They wouldn't easily hand them over to the Morales because even if the Morales lost, in the time that it had spent in their possession, it might be reverse engineered, and they wouldn't stand for that. So in the end they had given this item instead, and its introduction was very brief. Reversing disc. Inject your force and it will expel the opposing force. Resist the change to train your force. Lionel's brows jumped. Wasn't this exactly like his Lotus domain? His eyes narrowed. This matter definitely wasn't so simple. He activated his internal sight and scanned the disc in its entirety, but he didn't find anything out of the ordinary. It seemed to do exactly what the description said. But Lionel did find something else that was shocking. This was definitely a life-grade treasure, but more importantly than that, it gave off a sort of familiar energy that Lionel recognized. The Cataclysm Zone. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. This was definitely the unique air of the Cataclysm Zone. It reminded him of the other treasure he had in his possession. The Cataclysm Zone wasn't just ahead of their simulation, in terms of fighting prowess, but their crafting was on a completely different level. From what Lionel had seen, even their standards for black, bronze, silver and gold grade couldn't compare. This is why even until now Lionel was still using the force crafting quill he had gotten from them despite technically being able to forge a better, one with his life grade status. Though of course quills weren't that easy to forge because they required special materials from living creatures. This disc fell into a similar category. It was of the life grade, but it was a life grade that existed on the standard of the Cataclysm Zone, and as a result, was in a plane of its own. It was no wonder the explanation was so simple. The Omen didn't believe that the Morales could find more information about it through normal means. Lionel flickered and vanished. Anastasia, start an analysis on this treasure. Reverse engineering was an ability that Anastasia definitely had. In fact, if given enough time, she might even be able to construct a replica. The reason why Lionel had to forge it himself first before she could mass-produce things for him was that it greatly simplified the process because then she would only have to copy him. However, it could be said that reverse engineering was the foundation of this mass-producing ability. Although he spoke these words, Lionel still deployed his own dream world. As Anastasia was completing the task, he was deducing on his own, picking the treasure apart. A diagram appeared in the air, formed of his emulation spatial force. He waved a hand and the disc suddenly split into countless pieces. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. This overly simple interior that looked like the workings of a watch or an analog computer. They reminded him of. Lionel waved a hand and a familiar silver disc flew into his hand. His thumb rubbed the outer surface of the disc and he frowned. This was obviously the dictionary that his father had left for him. It had been a long time since he had needed to use it, especially after he gained Wise Star Order, and then read all the books and research papers of the Void Palace. He was no longer that naive boy who didn't know anything. But he had still wanted to take apart this silver dictionary one day. Unfortunately, he still didn't have the skill. He couldn't even spot his father's peak. It was a bit exasperating. It was clear that there were large gaps between life-grade crafters as well. That said, why was the interior of the silver dictionary and this reversing disc so similar? Could it be that his father had learned crafting techniques from the Cataclysm Zone? Or was this just the natural progression of crafting? Lionel was a bit frustrated now. He knew that if he asked his father about it, he would be brushed off even in normal situations, let alone right after he had exposed him in front of his mother. Suddenly he grinned. "Hey, what's this disc and what's its relation to the way you were crafted?" A familiar, somewhat robotic version of his father's voice began to speak. Lionel's grin widened. As expected, the dictionary was just designed to do as it was told and answer questions appropriately. He had thought once before that it had already reached its limit, but maybe that was just him thinking too much. Usually, highly important information or information that his father thought he was too weak for would be redacted, but without noticing, Lionel's strength had reached a point where most of the information he hadn't been able to access before was laid out bare before him. *ping**. Defensive support treasure item. Life grade, 1st star inferior. Uses, reverse force, absorb force, dispel force, suppress force, train force. Responding to seed. There is no relation. Lionel's brows jumped. 1st star inferior? Wasn't that a grading system of the Cataclysm Zone? Why would this silver disc use it? Chapter 2123. Published at 1st of September, 2023, 11 o'clock and 19 seconds a.m. Chapter 2123. Humble servant. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. His father's silver dictionary responded with the grading system only seen in the Cataclysm Zone, but it had still concluded that there was no relation? Lionel frowned for a moment before he remembered something. This silver dictionary was known for being a tricky mistress. Unless he asked a hyper-specific question, it tended to skirt the issue. But when he thought about it, it made sense. At least, it made more sense to him now than it ever had before. The silver dictionary probably didn't store answers like a huge database would. Rather, if Lionel was correct, it deduced answers on the spot. The scanning function Lionel had taken advantage of to understand the missions of zones wasn't just an auxiliary function. It was the foundational function of the silver dictionary. The only stored information within the silver dictionary were the voice messages and video messages left behind by his father that would either help him complete certain training modules, or activate when he asked a particular brand of question. When Lionel had first reached this conclusion, He was in complete awe. This made the Silver Dictionary countless-fold more complex than he had originally given it credit for. It was like it was built with a foundational understanding of the world, and then could deduce everything based on this foundational information, almost as though it was a kernel of the universe itself. Knowing all of this, Lionel made his question more specific. These two items seem to have been forged using very similar techniques, and their inner components resemble one another. Why is that? To his surprise, though, Lionel didn't receive the answer he was expecting even after all of this. N0 Valus B. C0M Ping. These two treasures do seem to be built upon the same principles, but they are a product of convergent evolution. They are very similar, but entirely unrelated. The shock in Lionel's heart was even greater upon hearing this. The implications were almost too much to accept. He couldn't help but grin. Divergent evolution was when a species branched into two, forming different traits and eventually becoming two novel species of their own. Of course, it didn't have to be as exaggerated as that. It could also be as simple as polar bears gaining white fur while black bears gained black. Convergent evolution was the opposite. It was the process of two entirely independent species, unrelated to one another, gaining the same or very similar traits in order to combat the very same environmental factors. This could be any number of traits. In this case, the Silver Dictionary seemed to be implying that his father had independently created this form of crafting that was very much in line with what the Cataclysm Zone called their own. In that case, his father hadn't necessarily been to the Cataclysm Zone before, but this only made his feat all the more astounding. Even with these two items before him, Lionel couldn't even begin to comprehend them. They were on an entirely different level, but his father had created it on his own. What form of crafting is this? Lionel asked. Ping. This form of crafting is known as simplistic convergence by Father Overlord. It takes the rule that a craft with more parts is more complex and reverses it, attempting to minimize the number of moving parts, and creating a maze of layered blueprints that can allow a simple mechanism to be responsible for many actions at once. The Silver Dictionary continued to ramble, but the most important part was in the first. Indeed, according to Lionel's understanding, the more parts a craft had, the higher level it tended to be. In fact, this was part of the difficulty of forming a life-grade blueprint. To have so many moving parts be of one mind and body was a tall task. It was no wonder these inner mechanisms reminded Lionel so much of a watch. On Earth, the mechanical watch had never been phased out despite the fact it was maybe the most primitive technology still alive aside from the wheel itself. Instead, watchmakers took pride in making so-called in-house movements that were increasingly more complex and yet served just a single purpose: to move a second hand at a set and steady rhythm. Some watches might include moon and star cycles, but they were ultimately all following the same fundamental principle. Then it all hit Lionel at once. He wondered, did his father gain inspiration for this form of crafting from Earth as well? Now that Lionel thought about it, there were two things his father never took off. The first were his glasses and the second was his watch. It was an old leather watch with an incredibly simple white face. It was thin and unassuming. But as expected, after seeing his father for the first time in so long, it was right there. The shocking reality awakened Lionel, and he felt enlightened, and yet confused at the same time. He realized that this level of crafting was still impossibly far beyond him. There was simply nothing that he could do to understand this right now. However, more carefully than ever, he stored the Silver Dictionary away after asking it all the questions he wanted to. Then he called James forward. "O mighty Emperor Lionel, thank you for calling thy servant. Your humble knight is here to serve you." James bowed low, but in return he got a kick for his efforts. "I'm sorry, Emperor. I'm sorry. Please forgive this humble servant." James begged for forgiveness. Lionel was exasperated. All right, I get it. I called you here for a reward, but it seems that you don't want it. Maybe I should just call someone else." James suddenly appeared by Lionel's side. "Lionel, OL buddy, OL pal, you wouldn't do that to your boy, right? We were raised in the same crib practically. We peed in the same bed. I didn't meet you until I was 4 years old." "Potato, tomato, now gimme," James grinned, snatching the bronze disc. Lionel laughed and shook his head. letting James take it. Chapter 21-24. Published at 1st of September, 2023, 11 o'clock and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 21-24. Protective mechanism? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel chuckled as James left. That annoying guy had a way of making him feel better, and yet annoyed at the same time. Once again, he didn't hesitate to give something so valuable away. In fact, this might even be more valuable for James than the transcendent whetstone would be for Emna. That disc didn't seem to be very related to James, but if one thought about it, it was essentially James' ability index in treasure form. It could take in force, absorb it, expel it. James' strongest ability was nerfing a specific type of force within a certain region, and the treasure also had that ability as well. The only thing that James couldn't do was convert one force to another type of force, but with that treasure he could obviously use it as a medium to do so. That said, Lionel didn't want James to rely on the treasure like a crutch. Rather, what he wanted was for James to study the runes of the treasure and gain a deeper understanding of them. Then he could use the treasure as a jump-off point to improve his own ability index and lineage factor. It had to be remembered that both Emna and James were sparks. Emna had a taller mountain to climb and more hurdles to jump over, which was why she was so much more powerful than James. As for James himself, his hurdles were lower because he was already born with great talent as a person of Earth. He wasn't a particularly introspective person either. So much of his advancements came naturally and without much effort. If he made full use of the bronze disc, his abilities should take a massive leap forward. By then, he would become the second person on par with both himself and Aina. At that point, they would truly be unstoppable. If one added Ellerin, Old Hutch's grandson, and Amory to the equation, the core of Lionel's formation would be nigh undefeatable. Ellerin may have lost handily to James, but Lionel wouldn't necessarily say that James was undisputed. James just happened to be the perfect counter to Ellerin. That said, Ellerin ran into similar problems as James, but for different reasons. Ellerin was very introspective and had grinded every day to improve himself. His issue was that his ability index was far too special, and it took him walking 10 miles to see through what someone would see walking 1. And that was despite having impossibly high talent already. As for Amory, his problem was only life and death experiences. But very soon he would get much more of that. These weren't things that Lionel was worried about. Instead, the true problem with these two was whether or not they would follow him without causing problems. The more powerful a person was, the more difficult it was to guarantee such a thing. I wonder though, why didn't the Seared family force me to hand back Amory immediately? Unless they assumed that it was useless to ask until they brought forward compensation. This was indeed an odd situation. But Lionel felt that that answer was probably true enough. In 0-value-SB, C0M regardless, he felt that investing in those around him so that he didn't always have to do everything himself was an excellent best. He hadn't given nearly enough to his brothers and those around him. After a slight nod to himself, Lionel took out the Omen family's treasure. This was the third of the treasures he was most looking forward to. Although the Pious family was a bit interesting, with how low profile they were constantly, Lionel didn't believe that they would put forward anything of great shock. And since Shield Cross Stars and the Void Palace weren't participating, this was definitely the top-of-the-line compensation. That said, Lionel didn't really expect very much from the spirituals' religion either. With their pacifist tendencies, they didn't seem to have entered the air wars for victory. If they were planning to lose, what could they have brought forward? If Lionel had to guess, this treasure was one of two things. It was either completely useless, or something that they were certain that only spirituals could use. And sure enough, Lionel took out an orb. The moment he touched it, he felt a familiar feeling. It was the feeling of his soul trying to be sucked out of his body. The last time he had felt this, Wise Star Order had been trying to trick him into learning a technique of the spirituals. Back then, Lionel had had no idea that the spirituals protected all of their techniques, so that all non-spirituals that tried to use them would be harmed. However, Lionel wasn't the Lionel of the past. Aside from a slight tug, he felt nothing else. His soul strength surprised even himself, quite frankly. But there was something else more curious. Why didn't Ancestor Hito warn him about this? Lionel's gaze flickered, but he shook his head after a long while. That old man is quite something, Lionel thought with a chuckle. He didn't believe that Hito was trying to harm him. In fact, he was certain that that old man knew what would happen and allowed it anyway because he was confident in Lionel. After Lionel looked at the introduction, his brows shot up. Interesting, so this isn't just a protective mechanism. This so-called soul extraction orb is precisely designed to pull your soul out from your body. Is this how Amory succeeded in separating his own? Lionel only knew a single crude method for separating the soul from the body. Whether it was himself or Raylion, both of them had to destroy their bodies first before succeeding. But it seemed that the spirituals had a far more elegant method. I see, so I've wrongly accused them. They weren't trying to harm me at all. That said, this item is pretty useless. Without the methods of the spirituals, separating your body and soul only allowed you to be a bit more immune to death than the usual person, but it doesn't grant you anything else. Maybe. Lionel pulled out the silver dictionary again. Chapter 2125. Published at 1st of September, 2023, 11 o'clock and 13 seconds a.m. Chapter 2125. Extraction. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Ping. Soul extraction orb. This item is used to separate the soul and body. In lower life forms, the soul is omnipresent and impossible to detect and sense. As a result, when the body dies, the soul dies. The only exception are those with special ability indexes, or those of higher races. Some races, such as the spirituals, are even born with their souls alone, and then construct their bodies after birth. Lionel had asked what the object and what the significance of soul extraction was, but he didn't expect this answer. Did that mean that humans were the only lower life forms without the ability to separately sense their souls? Why is the omnipresence of the soul within the body classified as low level? Ping. Replying to Seed, the soul is formed of soul force. Soul force is unique from person to person. When this soul force is diffused into the body, it becomes further tainted and further removed from the origin of dream force that birthed it. This makes it more difficult for higher class talents to be born, and even those of equivalent talent will be weaker in this state. Lionel's brows couldn't help but jump as he had a bad feeling. What happens if you separate the soul from the body after birth as a lower life form? Ping. If being born with soul and body separate is first class and being born with them fused is third class, then separating them after birth would be second class. But even then, the progress will be slow and only occur over the course of a long time as the cells of the body turn over, and the person in question trains. The damage to affinity and talent has been mostly done after birth, and it is difficult to reverse. Lionel sucked in a cold breath. This was what he had thought. He had been hoping to hear something else, but clearly it wasn't in the cards for him. When one thought about it, it made sense. The spirituals were born with just their souls, but as a result, they were able to construct perfect bodies for themselves. All of the talent that they had was stored within their souls, so whether they would have innate nodes or not, for example, was already predestined. It could be said that the body was just a projection of what the soul was, and if they were born as one, then the soul couldn't do its job properly. The spirituals were the highest form of this, but there were several other races who had their souls birthed within the womb first, before their bodies were constructed, and as such could stand almost shoulder to shoulder with spirituals. Also, it was hard to say which among these races and the spirituals had it better. That was because not every spiritual would have access to the perfect resources to construct their bodies, while not every body formed within the womb would be perfect for the soul it was bonded to. Either way you sliced it, though, the spirituals at the very top, the noblest of them with access to all the resources in the world, would have access to the greatest and most perfect bodies. In addition, from time to time, those among races with bodies constructed after souls in the womb would hit the lottery a few times a generation with geniuses with perfect bodies as well. As for humans, well, humans were essentially screwed at that front. There was simply no lottery to hit for them. Lionel chuckled. Although he had reconstructed his body, he had done it with instant recovery. It just reformed his body based on the previous blueprint, Nothing had changed. As for Raylion, his situation was similar. Unless one could figure out what was wrong with their body ahead of time, no amount of reconstruction would change anything. At best, separating one's body and soul would allow slow improvement over time, but perfection would be impossible. There was another problem as well. Aina had told him that his father had a sort of seal on him. He felt that that seal had finally been entirely undone, but it also left him even more at a loss of what to do. He didn't even know the first step to take. His soul was already tainted. How could he cleanse it? Suddenly Lionel froze. The spark shot through his dreamscape was so violent that lightning almost manifested in the real world. His clones, which were manning the starships, rippled wildly, almost dispersing. Cleanse? Dimensional cleanse? Was it a coincidence? Was he grasping at straws? Aina. Lionel suddenly spoke. Not long later, Aina strolled in with a raised eyebrow, but Lionel only tossed her the soul extraction orb. Use it. Aina blinked but didn't think much. Soon, she felt a weird pressure coming from within. She felt as though the deepest part of her being was being ripped out from her. The pressure coming from Aina suddenly doubled, and then it doubled again. The look on her face became somewhat pained, but she didn't stop. For Aina of all people to show such an expression, Lionel knew for certain that what she was truly experiencing was world-shattering. Maybe this method was no less painful than being eaten alive. Even so, Aina didn't make a single sound. And zero VLUSB. C0 Lionel watched in silence, but his expression was very serious. Lost in thought, he thought about the fact that his was a simulation once again. Anything that could appear in here was, in all likelihood, available in spades to the outside world. If this orb was really so useful toward changing their fate, they wouldn't be in their current situation. The same went for dimensional cleanse that had appeared in here. No? But Aina was a bit unique. She had Brazinger blood flowing through her veins, so her family line was from outside of this simulation. In addition, she had a unique ability index that allowed her to subconsciously understand the best path to take her body down. He wondered if he allowed Aina to separate her soul from her body, would she be able to naturally understand how to make herself perfect? Chapter 21-26. Published at 1st of September, 2023, 11 o'clock and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 21-26. Nothing made sense if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Veins popped up all across Aina's body, her power fluctuating wildly as her blood force threatened to break free of her control. But after several moments, it finally seemed to calm down. She took deep gasps, however before she had even caught her breath, she gasped in shock, her expression changing again and again. And zero VLUSB. C0 she felt as though her body was levitating at the moment. Her ability index had become sharper than she had ever imagined it becoming. It was as though rather than just being able to see one step ahead, she could see two. Usually, she would have to identify a problem or a roadblock she faced, and then go through a database of information she had within her mind to find the perfect solution. But now she felt that she didn't just see the problem that she was facing currently, but she could see ahead to the problems she would face after they were resolved, or even branching problems that might manifest irrelevant of these matters. It was like the road ahead had been cleared, the fogginess that had blocked much of it lifting up a great deal. Now she didn't just see enough to take a single step forward, but 2 steps. That was a 100% increase in her ability index, and all because of a little stone? She looked down at the stone, quite speechless. Only then did she focus and find what had fundamentally changed within her. Whereas before her body had felt like both the engine and the car body, it was now just the car body, while a mysterious bundle of energy that could only be said to be the engine had separated. Suddenly Aina understood. The core of her ability should come from this bundle of energy, but while the bundle of energy was fused with her body, it was too difficult to distinguish what was fundamentally herself, and what were problems that should be corrected. As such, that limited the options she could take. But now, she gripped and released her fists, her golden irises shimmering. Crack. The stone's crack shocked her awake, and she looked at it with a bit of pity. It would be amazing if everyone could have such a feeling, but it seemed that this stone could only be used a limited number of times. Lionel looked toward the stone and shook his head. From his understanding, it could only be used 3 times, and each subsequent usage would force the person in question to undergo more pain than the last. That was because the stone had to work harder due to its imperfections, placing the body under greater stress. That aside, Lionel doubted that anyone would receive the same great advantages that Aina had. Her ability index was very unique. It had to be remembered that there was a point where even Aina herself couldn't tell where her ability index stopped, and where her lineage factor began. They had too many overlapping abilities, and the cloudiness made it difficult to take perfect advantage of the two. While this was good for continuing down a singular, unified path, it was bad for comprehending the inner workings of a singular power. Now, however, with it separated from her body, the ease had become far greater. Whatever benefits Aina was receiving now was just the tip of the iceberg. It had to be remembered that the lineage factor was rooted in the body and changes within it. Whether it was bloodline, additional organs, or changes to existing organs, these were all categories of lineage factor. Ability indexes, however, were bestowed by the regulator, and they were matters of the soul. Now that they had been separated, Aina's comprehension of both would become as clear as day. She was so happy that she almost squeezed all the air out of Lionel's lungs with just a single hug. Lionel coughed heavily. Okay, Miss Guinea Pig, your husband needs your help? What did you call me? Aina squeezed tighter. Mercy, it's a joke. Aina nodded with satisfaction, and then quickly came to understand what Lionel had meant. It seemed that she would be testing to see how one might form a perfect body after separating the soul. After some hesitation, Lionel shook his head and then passed down the layers of dimensional cleanse, up to the 6th dimensional layer to Aina. Now that he had fully comprehended all the layers he wasn't restricted to passing it down in the slightest. The knowledge had truly become his own, and he didn't have to rely on anyone else. It was a long shot, but he thought that maybe it was still worth exploring. His dreamscape had never stirred him wrong before, so maybe he would get a pleasant surprise this time. Even so, Lionel wasn't very optimistic. That was because things weren't adding up. This simulation had likely been created for the sake of something their creators feared. If he had to guess what this threat was, he would probably guess other races and specifically the demon race, but the answer was unimportant. That was because all that mattered was the fact that they needed to get stronger. An excellent way to get stronger would be precisely something like dimensional cleanse, if it was capable of surpassing the issues of being born with a fused soul. So if it was really possible for it to do such a thing, why did they need this simulation? That aside, even if they knew about this secret of dimensional cleanse, why would they create humans who weren't aware of how to circumvent this weakness of theirs? Why would they allow inferior examples of humans to propagate? If they already had this technology, what use were weak, fused soul humans to them? Clearly they could simulate better versions. After all, weren't there spirituals here too? Lionel suddenly felt a headache coming on, not a figurative one, but a very real one. His mind was fatigued. No matter how he forced himself to think, there were simply too many questions and not enough answers. That was right, if they could create spirituals. Then why would they fear the demons? Nothing seemed to make sense. Chapter 21-27. Published at 1st of September, 2023, 10:59 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 21-27. Time force. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a breath and closed his eyes. Although he had more treasures to go through, he directly shook his head. He needed rest. Without another word, he entered a pod and entered a deep sleep. It wasn't until 3 hours later, the equivalent of almost 2 weeks, that he finally stepped out. His mind felt far sharper, and he was also much calmer. These questions weren't things that he allowed to bother him any longer. The answer didn't matter. All that mattered to him was that Aina wanted their babies to be little princes and princesses. Simulation or not, real world or not, did it matter? He would just conquer it all, and enjoy the smile on his wife's face. With a sharp gaze, Lionel went through the remaining treasure in the spatial ring. As expected, None were as world-shattering as the first three. He didn't really want to waste his time with these things, because there was nothing here better than simply training with the segmented cube. The segmented cube? Lionel's eyes suddenly lit up. Indeed, why hadn't he thought of that? He had been looking for something to strengthen his most powerful combatants. In his mind, his top priority currently was the improvement of Aina, James, Emna, Ellerin, and potentially Amory depending on how things went. He had already greatly helped the first three, but Ellerin had stumped him. He had hoped to find some inspiration, but how could families weaker than even the Morales and Seward families have something as rare as a treasure that could help a time ability index user? And even if they did, they would likely take such a thing to the grave. How could they allow others to know when they could use the FAA section AUDE of their weakness to avoid its reveal? But Lionel had forgotten that he had the ultimate treasure right with him. Whether it was the snow globe or the suspended animation pods that had spun off from them, both were a spectacular application of time force. There was nothing else that could be used to describe them. It was very likely that Anastasia knew something about this force that others simply didn't. Anastasia. Lionel called the little cloud spirit over again. The analysis of the bronze disc was still going, although he had given James, but Anastasia could multitask quite easily, especially since this was a question that should be within her purview to answer. You're ordering me around a little bit too freely, don't you think? And didn't I sense your father? That bastard is actually so close and won't come to say hello? How dare he? Anastasia seemed to have been holding in this belly full of anger for quite a while, but finally couldn't anymore. She had wanted to play it off and be as uncaring as Velasco was, but clearly that wasn't within herself to do. Lionel smiled bitterly. That old man was too busy sucking up to his mom after his past as a pervert was exposed to focus on anything else right now. How could he have the time to remember Anastasia, especially since he had already given the segmented cube to Lionel to control? Humph. Anastasia's lower half, formed of clouds, bristled and shook, even darkening as though she would begin to shoot out lightning bolts. Okay, I'll bring him here to see you, promise. That aside, what do you know about time force? Do you think that it's possible for you to pass on any of that knowledge to someone else? Anastasia froze for a moment, then looked toward Lionel. You don't have any talent in such things. Just like Dream Force, if someone without affinity tried to mess around with Time Force, they'd only hurt themselves. The consequences for messing with Dream Force might be devastating in that you'll forget yourself, but there's always a small chance you could come back. If you mess around with Time Force without affinity, you won't just figuratively lose yourself. The devastation would be very real, and there would be no coming back. Death would be the easiest and simplest outcome. Lionel wanted to explain that this wasn't for him, but then he suddenly became curious when Anastasia said this. What would be a worse outcome? N0 C0M. How about being caught in a perpetual loop where you can only experience that same death again and again? Anastasia said, somewhat annoyed. Lionel sucked in a cold breath. He had experienced being eaten alive once before, but what if he had to experience that again and again? The causalities you have to deal with when using Time Force can easily trap you, unless you have a talent for telling the difference between reality and constructs. Only death awaits you. Why do I feel like my spear can kind of use Time Force then? Lionel suddenly asked. Anastasia looked at Lionel deeply before shaking her head. Everyone has Dream Force in them, can they use it? Everyone has Soul Force, but can they freely wield it? In truth, calling it Time Force is incorrect. It's more accurate to call it Causality Force, Reality Force, even Creation Force would be more accurate. Time Force is the foundation that gives everything else meaning. Even space, location, and size are all irrelevant before time. Without time, there is no existence. You can describe a being without describing their location, but you can't separate them from the causality they're tied to. There was nothing before time came into being, and there'll be nothing after it vanishes. The so-called Time Force you're controlling is only you taking control of the causality of your spear. You've gained enough understanding of it to begin to shift and change its very being with your spear force, but don't mistake that for controlling Time Force. These aren't the same things. Lionel's eyes widened. Anastasia had never spoken so much in one sitting, but when she finally did, Her words seemed to hold the weight of a world. Chapter 2128. Published at 5th of September, 2023, 12:38 and 1 second p.m. Chapter 2128. Mistake: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. He seemed to gain a deeper understanding of his spear force and the direction it was going in. You don't need to worry, Anastasia. I wasn't asking for myself. I already have too many things on my plate dealing with forces I do have affinity for, let alone ones I don't. I was asking for someone else. I thought of the snow globes and the pods and realized that you must have some comprehension of such things. And it seems that I was right. Anastasia snorted. Every world spirit do. Anastasia, seemingly realizing that she had made a mistake, suddenly stopped talking. Her not speaking much wasn't a mistake. Usually she was quite talkative. It was just that she knew her own habits and thought to control herself using this path. But she had accidentally let something she had held close to her chest slip just like that. She looked toward Lionel, hoping he hadn't heard anything, but before she could sigh a breath of relief, he was blinking in shock and she blushed with shame and embarrassment. She had really let such an important piece of information go in such a stupid way. Stupid Velasco, idiot Velasco, this is all your fault. If I wasn't so agitated, I wouldn't have spoken so much and I wouldn't have made such a mistake. Lionel remained silent for a long time, and didn't answer immediately. He was still processing what Anastasia's words could mean, but in the end he smiled bitterly. He didn't have enough information. He actually didn't know what this could mean at all. All right, never mind that, Lionel said lightly. I don't know why you want to hide that you're a world spirit from me, but I assume it has something to do with the fact this is a fake, simulated world. Huh? I would blame you for thinking him too fragile. But then again, I did have a mental breakdown a couple of days ago. Anastasia froze. What did you just say? N0 Velasby. C0M. Lionel waved a hand. In what you would call a genius, deducing these things is child's play. Lionel looked up and suddenly started, finding Anastasia right before him. She surprised him, but she didn't say anything for a long while. Indeed. She finally mumbled. A pair of monster father and son. Makes no sense. Is this the miracle of the randomness of life? Lionel raised an eyebrow, but he let this little world spirit sort out her own emotions. Finally, she retreated, floating into the air again. Fine, depending on how this matter goes, I might tell you other things. She said lightly. For now, sure, I can help this person you speak of. Time force comes naturally to me. Does that mean my mother can use time force too? Lionel asked. He wanted to ask Anastasia to help his mother as well, in that case. Although his mother already had a world spirit, a complete one at that, something was telling him that Earth's world spirit and Anastasia were on two completely different levels. To his surprise, Anastasia shook her head. It's not that I don't want to help, but I truly had a slip of the tongue back then. World spirits that are more than blobs of instinct are incredibly rare. In all of existence, there are probably fewer than 10 like me. While one can help you comprehend the laws of your world, time force isn't something they can pass down. Even for me, such a thing is impossible. Even if you fused with someone? Lionel asked. I have a mind of my own. Although that makes me far more powerful than most world spirits, it also limits me as well. I cannot fuse with someone for the benefit of my world. That would suppress me rather than helping me. What I need is someone to partner with me and help me find precious resources. Once I succeed in entering the 9th dimension, I'll finally mature, and my world will fully take shape. Only then can I try to skirt some of the regulator's rules by passing down such knowledge. Lionel nodded slowly. I see, I understand. After a moment, he tossed over a snow globe. He's in here. We don't have much time, so I hope that you can train him in a time-dilated state. Try to see if you can make him obedient as well. Anastasia nodded and her eyes lit up. Indeed, Ellerin had a strong time force affinity. This was indeed perfect. Obedient? Her head suddenly popped up. Let's just say he's a bit unruly. His parents were killed due to a decision of Old Man Fox. His own grandfather stood in his way, and he was enraged enough to cut him down. So maybe being unruly isn't exaggerated enough for this person. His parents died. Indeed. They were likely to become invalids, so they were killed before the metamorphosis. I see. What? You can do something about that. Well, in the real world, no, but this world is more pliable, and it's even easier when the people in question have weak causalities. Third-dimensional beings without even ability indexes are about as easy as it gets. It would be helpless if they had entered the God path, or the 8th dimension of the conventional path, but this is too easy. Lionel was stunned. He suddenly realized that maybe there were a lot more things Anastasia was hiding from him, so that he wouldn't realize just how special she was too early. But now that he had exposed these matters, her misgivings were much less. She directly spoke about resurrecting 2 people who had died more than 30 years ago as though it was a trip to brunch. After a moment, Lionel grinned. After this, would Ellerin still dare to disobey him? Now that he thought about it, Hutch was in the 7th dimension of the conventional path at best, and his ability index was just as broken as his grandson's. If not for familial love, it was unlikely that Ellerin would have had a chance to win at all. Since you're busy being a god anyway, Anastasia, how about someone else? Chapter 21-29. Published at 5th of September, 2023, 12:38 p.m. Chapter 21-29. Don't. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The person that Lionel had thought of first was, of course, Anna's mother. Of course, he had Hutch in mind as well. But the one he most wanted to see happy could be no one else but Anna. The weight that Anna had carried all this time had started from that very day her mother was executed for having the audacity to bear her as a child. It wasn't just rage, but it was also helpless exasperation and, most importantly of all, guilt. If she hadn't been born, then maybe her mother would still be fine. Maybe she wouldn't have to suffer such a cruel fate. Maybe she and Anna's father wouldn't have been found out and so severely punished. But there was already no going back to reverse all of these things. There was only one thing left. Revenge. And she could only hope that it would be enough to fill the void in her heart. However, before long, Lionel's eager smile had faded. He looked toward Anastasia, who had a furrowed brow, and his heart sank. He didn't seem to need to hear the reason because it was of little importance to him now. But he still asked. You can't do it? Lionel asked softly. When he had heard that resurrecting those that had only been in the 3rd dimension was easy for her, Lionel had immediately thought of Anna's mother. But how could it be that there was still a roadblock here? What could possibly be stopping it? I can't know. Anastasia slowly shook her head. Are you sure you have the right person? Lionel asked. All he had told Anastasia was that it was Anna's mother he wanted to resurrect. He hadn't given her any other details because even he hadn't had any other details. Plus, although he had confidence in Anastasia, he didn't want to alert Anna in case something went wrong, and time had proven that his caution was correct. Even so, he had to ask, was it possible for Anastasia to be 100% certain of who she was targeting when things were just like this? Anastasia shook her head. A parental relationship is the easiest causal relationship to see through. If I had to look for a distant cousin, maybe there'd be a small chance I could make a mistake. But since Anna is here, and it's her mother that's in question, it's practically a one-to-one relationship. I wouldn't make such a mistake. It's definitely her. But Anna's mother died before the metamorphosis. She's also in the 3rd dimension just like Ellerin's parents. Why is one possible but the other isn't? I don't know. I can only speculate. Someone with a far greater causality is interfering with Anna's mother's own, entangling it to the point that I wouldn't be able to extract her perfectly even if I tried. If I forced it, what came out the other side wouldn't even be her mother. It would just be a woman who carried a similar form. Lionel's heart shuddered. Hearing this, he realized that resurrecting people wasn't nearly as easy as he had thought it would be. But at the same time he felt somewhat empty. N0 Velisp. C0 MHE had spent so long looking for the meaning of life. Why was it that this world didn't allow him to rip off the band-aid in its entirety? Why couldn't life just be completely worthless through and through? But now he was hearing that those with lower value lives could be more easily resurrected than those that were more powerful. It was as though his worldview that all lives were equal was being spit at and smacked across the face time and time again. And yet he couldn't even benefit from it. It was frustrating. Would this be because she married Anna's father? No, this isn't enough. But Anastasia hesitated. Tell me, Lionel said firmly. Remember how I said finding a parent through Anna was exceptionally easy because it was a one-to-one relationship in causality? Well, the reverse is true as well. It's difficult to affect someone else's causality, but the closer you are to that person, the easier it is. And having literally given birth to a person. Lionel paled and he sat down. There were very few things that could make him react like this, but he felt like he was feeling Anna's emotions for her at the moment. If Anna knew that her mother couldn't be brought back because she had grown too strong, how devastated would she be? No, even beyond that, wasn't it because of revenge that Anna had put in so much effort to increase her strength? And now because of that strength she had worked so hard for, she would never be able to see her mother again? How cruel was a fate like this? What Lionel didn't know was that there was something else that Anastasia hadn't told him. If she was correct, things might have still worked if Anna was still in the sixth dimension. One would enter the God path upon entering the sixth dimension, but because her mother was one step removed from her causality, the impact was lessened. However, the moment she entered the seventh dimension, it was just one day, just a single day was the difference between Anna being able to cry in her mother's arms or not. Just a single day. Lionel took deep breaths and slowly managed to calm himself. Don't resurrect them, Lionel suddenly said. What? Don't resurrect Ellerin's parents. Leave them as they are. Lionel didn't say anything else as he stood and left. Anastasia could only look toward his back with a complicated twinkle in her eye. She understood. If Anastasia resurrected them, then Anna would learn about it one way or another. Anna was quite intelligent. She wouldn't believe that Lionel would put in the effort to resurrect the parents of others, and yet not her own. If she realized this, then she would only be one step away from the truth. Lionel refused to see that kind of pain on the love of his life's face. Chapter 2130. Published at 5th of September, 2023, 12:37 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 2130. Fortune from misfortune. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Many minutes later, Lionel finally managed to calm down. This matter was far more complex than he had expected, and it felt like the world was playing a practical joke on him. So close and yet so far away, just a single step away and yet miles away. N0 via lusp. C0MG suddenly heard the echo of a familiar laughter in his mind. He didn't remember having laughed like this in the past, but for some reason he was certain that it was his own laughter. The laughter sounded quite heroic, and yet there was an undertone of sadness and helplessness hidden within, an echo that grew louder and louder until his vision suddenly went white. When Lionel came to, he was still standing in the same spot. His body was drenched in sweat, but other than that, he seemed like the same person he had always been. Taking a breath, he returned to the living setting and entered his and Anna's personal bath. He had already reached a state of cleanliness where he could spend months, even years, without a shower and still be fresh, but right now he felt like he really needed one. He slipped into the cleansing waters after stripping down his clothes and lowered himself into the water. The water slid around him until he had submerged even his head, sinking to the bottom of the large pool. He breathed deeply, ignoring the waters around him. When the cleansing waters entered his lungs, rather than flooding them and leaving him gasping like one might expect, it immediately became vapor, dispersing into his body. Lionel hadn't expected this. In truth, he had just made a mistake. He had wanted to do what he had recently begun to do in the water, filtering out wind force from the water force and inhaling that. But in his absent-minded and somewhat fatigued state, he had forgotten that cleansing waters were the purest form of water force. There was no wind force within it at all to filter out and breathe. Just when he thought that he would be drowned by his own foolishness, and was prepared to rush up to the surface to expel the cleansing waters from himself, this had happened. His body suddenly began to tremble. Deep-seated and hidden imperfections began to be pushed out one after another. Lionel was rendered speechless. He hadn't expected that things would actually end up like this. He had been thinking about how to help his body approach perfection, and he had actually stumbled into the method in such an unbelievably stupid way. Quickly, Lionel calmed down and accessed some things. Only then did he realize that this wasn't a natural state of cleansing waters, or most accurately, not just anyone could inhale cleansing waters like this. If someone else tried, they might truly drown themselves. The sudden vaporization of the cleansing waters he inhaled was a result of his new lineage. Or rather, a result of his previously evolved metal synergy lineage factor evolving once again. Lionel's new lineage factor built upon the 4 components of the metal synergy lineage factor quite beautifully. The first component was the one all Morales had access to, and that was the ability to absorb the life of metals and make it their own. The second, the one the Radix family had received, was the reverse. To take one's life and bestow it upon metals. The third was what was given to the Midas family, and that was the ability to swallow flames and gain endless life force from them. The fourth was given to the Flora family, and it was ultimately the ability to bestow life once again. The way Lionel had seen it, although these were separated into 4 more complex bits, they were ultimately 2 larger halves. One that could take life and make it one's own, and the second was to bestow it and grant power. One relied on refinement of external sources to grant oneself power, and the second relied on refinement of internal sources to grant an external object power. Both formed a yin and yang sort of balance, and there were all sorts of techniques that could branch from it. But what Lionel benefited from the most was the nigh infinite pool of longevity. Somehow, after the evolution, Lionel had gained the ability to refine more than just metal and fire. Even water seemed possible now, and he had gained the largest store of unrefined waters right before him. Even if he tried to refine all of these cleansing waters, he wasn't sure if it would truly be possible unless he reached the 9th dimension. But by then these waters would expand once more, as Anastasia would definitely reach that level as well. As his pores dilated, Lionel found that his body had far more imperfections than he had thought. What was being expelled from him wasn't impurities, per se, but was rather like foul force. This force would be the kind that stopped normal force crystals from becoming pure force crystals. This sort of force, impeding those born with fused souls, was precisely what stopped them from reaching the perfect state of body and mind. These cleansing waters were only 8th dimensional, so Lionel wasn't sure if it would truly be able to allow his body to reach that state of perfection that only few geniuses of other races and a handful of spirituals had. But what he was certain of was that it would allow him to get much, much closer. I guess this can be counted as a disaster turning to fortune. Lionel whispered to himself softly, the complexity of a pie forming in the sky, only to land right in his face, and then for another one to form soon after had brought him through a roller coaster of emotions. Suddenly, Lionel gripped his fists. The complexities of life were something that smacked him in the face every time he tried to gain an inkling about what truth may lie behind the doorway. But he felt that maybe he was going about this all wrong. He had always felt like he should have an answer first before he decided what road he should take, but did he have a right to gain such an answer at his current strength? Maybe instead of that, he should do the reverse, work to strengthen himself so that maybe one day, he too could laugh like that. Chapter 2131. Published at 5th of September, 2023, 12:37 and 42 seconds p.m. Chapter 2131. Not quite. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. As Lionel was meditating in the depths of a pool of cleansing waters, the situation in the Void Palace was only getting worse with every passing moment. The domain-ranked disciples that remained had worked their whole lives for this matter, and they carried resolute faces as they faced off against legions of otherworldly beings. But their resolution did nothing to change the fact of the matter. They were entirely outmatched. In the past, the humans had at least had the advantage of numbers. There were so many roads that they cultivated that there was bound to be at least one a person could excel in. This was about the only advantage humans had over the other races. However, the Void Palace had suffered devastating losses due to the cataclysm. And to make matters worse, even if they hadn't, they were facing the combined numbers from several races at once. Not that they were also missing so many of their own. What chance did they stand? The nomad race, the cloud race, the Rapax race, even the dwarven race and the beast domain were attacking. It seemed that every single one of them wanted a piece of the pie, and they weren't willing to take even a single step back. They flooded in from 5 different directions, assaulting the humans on all fronts. They were stretched thin and there was simply nothing that could be done. And this was before even any ancestors showed up. With the way things looked, it seemed as though the human domain would fall without the 8th-dimensional experts of the other races even having to lift a hand. However, there seemed to be good news. Even after the first line of defense was breached and the second was halfway through falling, the spirituals had still not shown up. The spirituals rarely participated in conflicts and they didn't seem to care for the land of others. There were a rare few stragglers who came out from time to remind the world of the power of their race, but other than that, there was absolutely nothing. That said, it had been a long while since the last 8th-dimensional world had appeared. It would be hard to tell what they would be willing to do in this situation. As a result, they became like a lingering guillotine in the air. But so long as they didn't appear, the situation wasn't helpless quite yet. On the side of the humans, the Void Elders stood outside the tallest peak of the Void Tower, their expressions solemn and their wrinkled faces contorted. They could see that the second line was about to fall. The prestige of the Void Palace has fallen too far. It had already been half a day, but there were no signs of those families appearing. The Void Palace wasn't worried that they wouldn't show up, but rather worried that they would show up far too late. They were waiting for everything to be perfect for them to make their appearance, not realizing that there would simply be nothing left to be perfect if they were any later. But it couldn't be helped. The prestige of the Void Palace had taken a huge blow after they failed to protect so many of their disciples. Many middle-of-the-pack families had sent their own hope in generations to the Void Palace, only to lose their child forever. Now those families were being called again, and it was hard to tell how they would feel. There's no choice. If they don't appear, the entire human race will be enslaved. It's already helpless, Void Elder Lisbeth said softly. What did you say? Void Elder Galliene, a drill sergeant among them, snapped almost immediately. I said that it's helpless. Who cares how many of them appear? What will they do when the ancestors of the other races start appearing? Even back when we had such a huge advantage in the number of 7th-dimensional existences, our number of 8th-dimensional existences couldn't match up to even one of the races, let alone so many of them. We have many paths to reach the 7th dimension, but none of them are excavated deeply enough to allow a large number to enter the 8th dimension. We are finished. Hearing a Void Elder say such words, the others were shocked, so shocked in fact that they couldn't even react to what happened next. Void Elder Galliene, who had just seemed to be reprimanding Lisbeth, turned around and swiftly attacked. It wasn't just him, but Lisbeth and Void Elder Vimark attacked all at once as well. The other Void Elders were caught off guard, many of them having their chests pierced and hearts shattered in a single swift move. You, Cornelius, who had only recently managed to become a Void Elder himself, was instantly enraged. He had never imagined that the people he had spent his whole life looking up to would suddenly do this. The remaining Void Elders suddenly recovered as well, but just when Cornelius was about to attack, he froze. He looked down, finding an arm piercing through his chest. He struggled to look back, but he never managed to see who it was. He had never expected it to be a two-layered plan. Only a part of the traitors had acted in the first rounds while the rest pretended to be shocked along with everyone else. Then just when it seemed the traitors were clear, the second group attacked. Cornelius didn't even know what to think in his final moments, until his thoughts suddenly settled on a particular one man for some reason. That young cub had given him such a headache in the small time he had known him for, but he had always seemed to pull out victory from the jaws of defeat. Cornelius slipped down, falling from the hand of the person who had attacked him, through the clouds below and toward the ground. The hand pulled back, slowly wiping their hand of blood as their features began to change. Do we attack now and finish it? Lisbeth suddenly asked. The person shook his head. Not quite yet. If Lionel had been here, maybe his heart would have stopped beating entirely. This man was someone he knew all too well. He was none other than Lionel Morales. Erdél's notes. For those who are confused, or don't remember, Lionel Morales is the savant from Earth that thought he was Lionel. He should be dead, but I guess not. Also, the author says maybe Lionel would have his heart stop beating, but let's be real. Bro just realized his world is a simulation and that people can get rezzed like it's nothing. I don't think this would surprise him. N0 VLISP. C0M. Chapter 2132. Published at 5th of September, 2023, 12:37 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 2132. Mercy if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel opened his eyes, feeling a strong surge of power flooding his body. The odd part was that he didn't feel as though his strength had changed a great deal, but for some reason he still felt far lighter than he ever had before. He didn't know what to say about that matter, but he slowly made his way out of the pool. Unfortunately, because he had spent so long out of the pod, he didn't gain the 100 days others likely had. But even so, he felt that it was worth it. After some thought, he had finally touched upon what that odd feeling was. It was like his body was a treasure, and it was being slowly refined toward the life grade. It was like his body already had all the building blocks, but it was missing the impetus to fuse into a perfect product, becoming one. Lionel had experienced this before. This was the feeling he had had before he succeeded in crafting his first life-grade treasure. When he connected the two, he was quite speechless. It felt quite crude to think of his body as though it was some kind of inanimate object. But when he took a step back, wasn't it exactly that? Earth had a dividing line between inorganic and organic materials, and the body was obviously formed of the latter, but higher in dimensions, that line blurred more and more. Plus, Lionel had already had a huge breakthrough in his Earth force that was caused by his realization that the body was quite reliant on Earth force to survive, or else where would the important minerals that kept them healthy come from? Everything had a balance to it, and there was no reason to treat his body any differently than he would a treasure. In fact, his body was almost irrelevant. What was most important was its use as a medium to allow his soul and ethereal glabella to display their strength to the greatest degree. As expected, Lionel's body didn't reach the level of perfection that he was looking for, but the change was still quite substantial. There was still quite a long process left. He would have to be patient, waiting for his cells to turn over and then undergo the process again. The more times he did this, the better his body would be at producing cells that were closer to perfection, and the closer to perfection he would be overall. His force flowed through his force nodes much smoother. At that moment, Lionel looked up, only to find that Aina had suddenly rushed in. He smiled. "What's wrong? You're actually in such a rush." "Cleansing waters," Aina suddenly said. "I think it would be very useful for this." Lionel smiled meaningfully. "You already figured it out?" Lionel chuckled. "Sort of, it was a bit of an accident. But it's crude right now. I'm only able to do it by breathing the water in. Someone else would end up drowning themselves. Do you have a better method?" Aina nodded. "I can use the cleansing waters as a binder in a force pill to amplify the effects. The other materials would just be supplemental to act as a binding agent to allow it to pass into the blood, the organs, and the cells effectively. It would take several treatments, but it should have a strong effect given enough time. The results would be better the more pain someone is willing to withstand." Lionel's eyes brightened. "Well, revisit this after this war." "After?" Aina's brows shot up. Why did Lionel sound so confident? It didn't seem like they were in a very good situation right now. It would probably be better if they held back now and only came forward when they had all their ducks in a row. When one took a step back, what were they worth in the face of the whole human domain? 1 billion warriors? That was a drop in the bucket. It might be enough to target a solar system, but even if one's target was only a galaxy, it wouldn't be nearly enough, let alone a sector or facing off against several domains at once. Lionel grinned. "Don't you think this is a good opportunity?" Aina's expression changed. She understood what Lionel wanted to do. The air wars put Lionel on the map, but if he performed well in this war, or if he actually won it for the human domain, how much easier would it be to unify it in the future? In fact, he might even succeed before the air wars were even through. It was a wild plan. That was all she could say about it. She couldn't help but hesitate. Was Lionel doing this because of her words about wanting their children to be royalty? But Anna's eyes wandered, feeling nervous. She couldn't just take these words back now, or else the weight of her words in the future would diminish. She also didn't want to see Lionel without drive and ambition. She felt that the world deserved to know his talent. In her stupor, she didn't even notice Lionel lean forward and kiss her forehead. You should trust your husband a bit more. And Zero Velisp. C0 Maina frowned, responding subconsciously as she wiped her forehead. Who's my husband? Why don't I see a ring? Lionel grinned. A ring, you say? Anna's heart skipped a beat, her frown suddenly vanishing into a panicking expression. However, it didn't last long because the mood was interrupted by Lionel's wheezing laughter. Anna turned beet red, her fists suddenly beginning to rain down. Usually she held back, but Lionel truly felt the pain this time. Mercy! Mercy! Lionel howled. Obediently take this beating. How dare you tease me about this? Despite his cries, Lionel was practically grinning ear to ear. A ring for his wife. How could he give her something casual? His aspirations were grand. What was a diamond before the keys to the Void Palace? What about the head of a spiritual? Or maybe he would make the dimensional verse kneel at her feet. Lionel suddenly sprang up and wrapped an arm around Anna's waist, lifting her into the air and planting a kiss on her lips. Chapter 2133. Published at 5th of September, 2023, 12:37 and 39 seconds p.m. Chapter 2133. Retreat. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. These humans are actually so worthless. What was all this preparation for? A nomad young man yawned. This young man mumbled to himself, watching the carnage without much care. He leaned back on his own floating hands, reclining in the skies without a care. He was well known among his race, but this went without saying since he was chosen to lead his own legion. He was Prince Gregwin, and was quite known for his laziness. He was probably the only nomad who would use his extra hands in such a way. The nomad race's standout feature was, of course, their 3 pairs of hands, 2 of which were attached by their wrists to their arms, and the remaining 4 of which floated around their bodies as though they had minds of their own. Then there was, of course, the gems on their foreheads, a protrusion of their ethereal glabellas. Gregwin looked off to the side. 2 of his floating hands acted as his seat, and the remaining 2 acted as his backrest. He looked quite comfortable, and yet he seemed to want more from the occasion. Did he feel bad about attacking the humans like this? Of course not. He only lamented that they weren't strong enough. The humans weren't unique in this matter. Every domain that formed an 8th-dimensional world like this would be invaded. Well, aside from the spirituals. And Zero Velisp. C0M that said, the humans were unlucky in the fact that so many were attacking them at once. Back when their nomad race had experienced this, only the beat domain had invaded. The only race that had experienced a similar level of pressure was the Dwarven race. And right now the Dwarven race had ironically sent the most experts. Clearly, the Dwarven race still held a grudge from being kicked out of the human domain back then. The worst part was that the Dwarven race were full of archery experts that were especially lethal in this density of anarchic force. Anyone who could expel their force over large distances was a huge asset in this void battlefield. And the Dwarven race happened to have the largest percentage of such existences. It'll probably only be another day before the second line is breached, and then just the third line would be left. By then, the entire human domain will be open to us, and the war will basically be over. It would be impossible for them to defend more from entering from the void battlefield, and deal with the wildfire spreading in their territory. The Dwarven race was dealing with their own problems, so they didn't want to overextend themselves by entering the human domain fully before, but now they won't have such scruples. Their defensive measures have grown too tough for others to continue to attack them now. It seems that the humans will be the new heel. Gregwin laughed uproariously. On the side of the Dwarven race, a pair of brother and sister stood in the air, the wings flapping. Their gazes were surprisingly cold despite their somewhat adorable appearances. Each of them held a bow in their hands, directly following traffic below. The gray skies were practically blackened by the number of arrows that were flying. The humans couldn't even get close before they were mowed down. It was a truly devastating sight. The humans could only form barricades to try and defend from the volleys, but with half the second line having fallen, the defenses simply weren't very great, and could only be hastily put up. This pair of brother and sister were likewise nobility of their race. This could be seen by the fact that they looked more like short humans as opposed to dwarves in the eyes of most. The princess, Aurora, and the prince Malchihorn. What was far more interesting, though, was the fact that the city they were currently besieging was one that Lionel would very easily recognize. It was the very one he had first run into when he returned from the Cataclysm Zone. And as expected, it was none other than Rowan. This was the very same young man that had almost killed Lionel after he had helped them to escape the Rapak's nest. Rowan Cancer had surprisingly not participated in the air wars, and had remained with the Void Palace. He hadn't told anyone why, but if he had said it, no one would believe him. The reality was that unlike others, he could see through the danger Lionel posed, and he wanted no part in it. It was, of course, due to his special ability index that he was so certain. And he had felt that he was quite smart while watching the broadcast. But who would have thought that he would end up so unlucky in the end? Suddenly, Rowan got an order that made his brows jump up. Retreat? What? Rowan couldn't even believe such a ridiculously stupid order. If they retreated from the position, they'd be completely finished. There was nothing to retreat back to but the first line, but the so-called first line was just the Void Palace itself. It was incredibly difficult to defend because the palace was only meant to be used as a life support. As difficult as it was to attack, it would simultaneously be hard on those who took it upon themselves to defend. To make matters worse, there was a forward legion below. Their blows from within the city weren't effective enough, and if they allowed the dwarven race to approach too closely, they would lose the city too swiftly. If they retreated now, how many of them would die? Rowan hesitated. This order was definitely official. It couldn't just be ignored because he disagreed with it. For all he knew, they had a better plan than he did. After another round of hesitation, it wasn't even Rowan himself who acted. He was yet to become a domain-ranked disciple. He realized at that moment that it wasn't up to him in the first place. The domain-ranked disciples were the true pillars of the Void Palace. They held the most authority. A domain-ranked disciple he knew as Avalair handed down the orders. Prepare for retreat. Ready the cannons for one final blow. Hurry. The words had only just fallen when the air trembled. Rowan's head snapped around to find a starship had suddenly appeared behind their city, shocking him into silence. Erdiel's note. 2 chapters today, none tomorrow and 3 on Saturday. Author's words, not mine. Chapter 2134. Published at 5th of September, 2023, 12:37 and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 2134. Defend if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. I just remembered that I promised 3 chapters today, but when I promised I forgot that I had certain obligations this weekend. I'll find another date to make it up. This was a completely unexpected change. Something so large should have been alerted to them in advance, but the fact that it hadn't made Rowan's eyes narrow. He felt that there was something big going on right now, and he felt far too small to handle it. The very purpose of the Void Palace was to act as a defensive gate to the human domain. This defensive measure worked in both directions. It was impossible to just casually enter the Void Palace from any direction whatsoever. The only ones that could even think about doing so were ancestor-level characters. The only way to the Void Battlefield was through the Void Palace, and the only way from the Void Battlefield to the human domain was, once again, through the Void Palace. For this starship to reach this location without a word from the higher-ups, it meant that it was here without permission. But anyone in the human domain with access to a starship was impossible high up on the food chain. Did that mean that the humans had traitors already? But news of the fall of the first line should have only been sent to the most powerful of families. But then again, only the most powerful families would have access to such a starship. Rowan felt his head spinning. No matter how much he thought, he could have never guessed that the traitors had come from the Void Palace itself. The Void Palace was the pinnacle of humanity. The Void Elders that led it had prestige surpassing all. They were the experts that had sacrificed their lifetime of happiness for the sake of the human race. Even Rowan, who was quite jaded about most things, would never suspect them. But when he saw who stepped out from the ship and onto the bow, his own expression couldn't help but change. Lionel Morales? As impossible as it was for the Void Elders to betray humanity in his mind, it made just as little sense for Lionel to do so in Rowan's opinion. It had to be remembered that the only reason they had survived the cataclysm and returned home in the first place was because of Lionel. Although Rowan hadn't known this before, who wouldn't be aware of this by now? Just what is going on? Domain Disciple Avalair frowned, but before he could say much, yet another domain ranked disciple appeared, and he was yet another person that Lionel was quite familiar with. This young man was none other than the very impetus for Lionel's falling out with the Void Palace. He was the one who moved behind the scenes to link the Lionel of the Milky Way to the Lionel FO the Void Palace, raising his fugitive status and causing Shield Cross stars to come to the Void Palace to apprehend him. Ronan Sith. Ronan was a member of Shield Cross stars, but more importantly, a member of their Sith-led assassin unit. His position was extraordinary, and the grudge he had with Lionel wasn't small at all. Back then, Ronan had been stalled by Lionel's aunt while he and Aina slaughtered much of Ronan's faction. Due to that, what had once been a powerful faction well on its way to becoming a legacy faction as Ronan promoted to the Void Senate crumbled before everyone's eyes. Ronan wasn't able to do anything as Lionel and Aina vanished, but now he seemed to have become an official domain-ranked disciple, and he very clearly stood on Avalair's side in wanting to follow orders and complete their retreat. Seeing Lionel, he seemed to have seen red, but he quickly regained his calm, coolly ordering that the retreat continue. However, it was then that Lionel took a step, his figure flashing as he landed on the top of the city walls. He was only a few meters from Ronan, but it was as though he hadn't seen anyone else. Sheesh, the Void Palace is getting more and more pathetic these days, huh? Lionel looked up, his gaze suddenly becoming sharp. Anyone who retreats dies. And Zero Velisp. C0M Lionel's voice thundered. It came as a completely unexpected change. The level Lionel's mind worked on was completely different from others, but this time his action was purely based on his endless trust in his father. His father had attacked the Void Palace all those years ago. To Lionel that meant that there were definitely traitors within them. It was that simple to him. If he accepted that as the truth, then it was impossible to do anything exactly to the wishes of the Void Palace. In fact, the reason Rowan and the others didn't receive any information about their arrival was because Lionel had directly shot by at the highest speed his craft could muster. They hadn't even been able to react. Everyone was stunned by these words. Those that had been following the orders of the domain-ranked disciples were caught in the crossfire, not knowing whether to continue or retreat. On the one hand, there were the domain-ranked disciples, but on the other there wasn't only Lionel who had saved them all from the cataclysm zone. But even more importantly than that, there was a starship even ancestors feared in the skies behind him. Ronan was completely taken aback. Lionel actually dared to say these words? At first, he was speechless until he was so enraged that he laughed. Do you think that because you did well against some little kids that you can do as you please now? Lionel's head turned toward Ronan, his gaze as deep as the depths of the starry skies. No. I can do as I please because the power I wield is greater than yours. The starship suddenly rumbled as a piercing beam shot forward. Aurora and Malkuhorn's expressions changed at the same time. Defend! They roared. They had set their moving formations to a standard that could deal with the cannons of the fortified city, but they hadn't expected for the cannons of a moving ship to be even better than a fortified city. It made little sense, and yet... Boom. Chapter 2135. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 2135. Closer. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's gaze flickered. The moving formation of the Dwarven race was incredibly unique. In his studies within the Void Library, Lionel had learned a lot about the warring habits of the various races. Usually, When launching a siege like this one, most races relied on siege towers that double as formation foundations. These foundations would become the core of force arts that would help the army to move forward and attack while they defended themselves. These defensive measures tended to be weaker than unmoving force arts for obvious reasons, but the one exception to this rule seemed to be the dwarven race that managed to have formations that were no weaker at all. The cannons of the fortified city weren't to be taken lightly. These cities had no less investment in them than starships did, and their attacking methods were no weaker, but the dwarven race had managed to weather them with their siege towers without the slightest hiccup. And then Lionel suddenly appeared. The beams of light winked out after their power was exhausted. The siege towers of the dwarven race shook a great deal, and some of the power leaked to the army below, causing many of them to die. But ultimately, the casualties were only in the few hundreds. Even so, this loss of a few hundreds was more than the city had been able to accomplish in several volleys. It was clear that this starship was on a completely different level. N0 VLISP. C0M. This was a true success, but there wasn't a hint of happiness on Lionel's face. He knew that if he fired again without changing anything, he would be lucky if a few dozen died, let alone a few hundred. In exchange for a slowed pace, the dwarven race could adjust the strength of their formations. They were caught off guard, but they wouldn't be caught off guard easily again. However, their speed had plummeted by more than 50%. Lionel had bought the fortified city a great deal of time. This seemed to be the perfect chance to retreat, but Lionel had no intention of doing so. In fact, the cannons of the starship were already revving again. At the same time, a second starship appeared, but this one was far larger. The first was only a few kilometers across, but this one was the size of a planet, and it dwarfed the entire battle, casting a shadow over everything. That said, this shadow didn't change much about the terrain. The void battlefield was an endless foggy and dull atmosphere to begin with. They were just swapping one form of darkness for another. Soon it began to fire on the dwarven race as well. The beams are about 3 folds weaker, Lionel quickly calculated. The larger starship is even worse, only being about 20% as powerful as usual. That should be due to both the anarchic force and the distance of separation. That's enough. Ronan barked. Did you think you could change the situation on the battlefield with a few starships? Do you know how many the Void Palace has on their own? What did you think you could accomplish? Don't come here to make a fool of yourself. Continue the retreat. Bang. Ronan had hardly finished talking when he felt a huge pressure suddenly crush his chest. He was sent flying like a broken kite. He only managed to stop himself a long while later, and could only feel lucky that whoever had hit him had done so across the city walls and not to the ground below. Unable to hold back, he coughed up a mouthful of blood, holding his chest. He looked up weakly to find a beauty with long, flowing black hair, standing by Lionel's side. He didn't even register when she had appeared. Ronan coughed again, taking deep breaths. To be a domain-ranked disciple, he had to at least have the strength of most Tier 7 7th-dimensional experts. He himself was only Tier 6, but with his talent, this was a difficult, but not impossible feat. But just now he had been slapped so far away by a single palm from a Tier 1 existence. Demoralize the human race again, and I'll have my lovely wife pierced through your heart next time. Watch your mouth. Lionel looked back toward the battle below. The humans, having gained some relief thanks to Lionel's actions, were able to reverse the situation somewhat. The siege towers were only designed to take on powerful, large-scale attacks. They weren't wasted on small-scale attacks from the army's men and women below. As such, that battle was far more level. It was just that the humans were far too outnumbered. In terms of direct combat, there was no large difference between the geniuses of the human race and the dwarven race, but a disparity so large. Lionel, however, seemed to be entirely focused on the siege towers, trying to look for a weakness. At least it seemed so until he suddenly snapped his fingers. The starships opened up one after another, billions of armored warriors making their way out. Their weapons clanged and the sound of surging energy whirred in the ears of the spectators. Their armors began to glow and they were quickly linked with one another. The human domain had seen Lionel's special armors before, but those armors had been created on a whim based on a sea creature he had only seen for a small moment before he began. These armors, however, were crafted to perfection. They were on an entirely different level. I need to get closer. Suddenly, Lionel's body flashed and his divine armor formed. There was a hint of a frown on his face because it didn't feel nearly as comfortable as it had in the past, but oddly enough, despite this, its strength had actually risen a great deal. He extended a palm and his black rod appeared. He stomped his feet hard, launching himself from the very walls Ronan had been fearful to fall from. Aina frowned as well, but she stayed put, realizing that Lionel wasn't asking for her to participate. It seemed that Lionel didn't treat this domain war much differently than he did the air wars he had just conquered. Chapter 2136. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 2136. Soaring. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. A single aura of the 6th dimension was completely out of place in a sea of 7th dimensional monsters, even more so when these 7th dimensional monsters were geniuses of other races, or the best geniuses that the human domain had to offer. And yet, Lionel didn't seem to feel the weight of the matter at all. In fact, his gaze flickered with fancy crimson lights that danced like embers within his irises. Beneath the helmet of his divine armor, a wild grin spread. The human race was weak, huh? He would be the judge of that. Bang! The ground beneath Lionel shattered. A roar filled the skies as his soldiers landed behind him, the earth rumbling and tumbling beneath their weight. And yet, in front of this monstrous tide, a singular young man who was nothing more than a speck of dust before the vastness of the void battlefield seemed to become the center of it all. Lionel's black rod rose, his 10 stars appearing to his back, one part hidden in darkness and the other bathed in a blinding radiance. His foot sank into the earth, countless cracks and devastating, bowing, boulders of earth raising from the ground as he exploded forth. He crossed the distance between the city and frontline warriors of the Void Palace in an instant. He soared above their heads, a flourishing pair of fiery wings appearing around him as he crossed the no-man's land toward the dwarven race. He seemed to have entirely lost his mind, too excited by the prospect of war and battle. He had done maybe the most foolish thing he could have, entering a piece of land that only left room for death. This no-man's land had formed after the dwarven race's pace slowed, due to the roaring lasers of the 2 starships. This kind of region was absolutely deadly under normal circumstances, let alone when facing a race of marksmen like the dwarven race. The eyes of Ulrora and Malkuhorn flashed at once. They didn't even need to give the order. The archers had already raised their bows, knocked them and fired. Their movements were smooth. It was an action they had lost track of the number of times they had completed. In truth, only one of them needed to act, but they had all reacted so fast that hundreds had fired at once. The rain wasn't exaggerated to the point of blotting out the skies, but it was simply too fast and too vast. There was nowhere for Lionel to dodge. But it was right then that the people of the fortified city seemed to remember something. Lionel's grin became wilder. Using archery against me? It seems I need to introduce myself to you invaders. Lionel's heart seemed to blaze with an undying fire, his voice booming. The anarchic force seemed entirely incapable of stopping the spread of his presence. His Scarlet Star Force wings expanded, and then expanded again. He came to a sudden stop in the air, his spear sweeping out before him. However, it wasn't aimed toward the coming arrows at all. Instead it drew a perfect arc on the ground below. It didn't seem to serve a purpose at all other than to display the sharpness of Lionel's blade even from afar. Until the arrows tried to cross it. One after another, the volley disintegrated to ash. It was as though the dividing line Lionel had casually drawn had laid down a law of causality, an unbreakable rule decided by the man standing high in the skies. Lionel was entirely unmoved by the failure of the arrows. The ash that remained of them continued to float in the air, dancing like the dead embers of a fallen hope. The tip of his spear trembled and he vanished. When he appeared again, he was standing before the front line of dwarven race members, and his blade flashed. In an instant, dozens of heads flew into the skies. Lionel took another step and vanished once more. Everywhere he passed by, his spear force would sparkle for just an instant before fountains of blood would fall. The bows and arrows of the dwarven race were entirely useless against him. Every time one tried to target him, it would disintegrate even before making contact. As for the close combat skills of the dwarven race, they were worse than trash. They were smaller than him, weaker than him, and in such a large group, their level of agility was entirely useless. Lionel's wings alone left a trail of death and destruction. He hardly tried, but every flap would send out a wave of heat and destructive aura, shattering protective armors and forces that were already struggling beneath the anarchic force in the surroundings. He was a one-man grinding machine. And then his army caught up with him. Streaks of lightning filled the air as several large eyes appeared in the skies. The dwarven race, which was already thrown into disarray by Lionel, was suddenly faced with an unending tidal wave of oppressive might. No matter how fast Lionel killed, he was still one person. He could at most kill 2 or 3 dozen per second. Against an army of tens of billions, it would take him decades to kill down to the last man. However, if Lionel was the Swiss army knife that disrupted their formation, and his army was the butcher's knife that ground down what remained, how much faster would his killing speed be? It simply couldn't be compared. Lionel's roaring laughter filled the skies. Indeed, the great dimensional verse didn't know the name Lionel Morales, but starting today, much like he had put the human domain on notice, he would make sure that they were aware of him as well. Because he was coming. Lionel flickered and vanished, or so he thought, but he quickly found that the siege towers had changed once more and his spatial force was restricted. Even so, the wild grin on his face didn't fade at all. He unleashed a roar, his spear spinning in his hands as a wild wheel of flames took shape, surging in all directions a single sweep, and wiping out over 100 dwarven race members, and he pointed his spear toward the skies toward the pair of prince and princess. A soaring battle intent surged out from his spear. N0 VLUSB. C0M. Chapter 2137. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 2137. Exposed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Billowing plumes of royal blue fog came from Lionel's divine armor. Standing in the middle of a region that had been entirely cleared by him, he looked like a war god descended from the very skies themselves, untouchable and noble. Bang! His gravity field seemed to activate on its own. The dwarven race members that were rushing to fill in the gap were crushed instantaneously. Their faces were driven into the ground before bursting into a puddle of flesh and blood. Lionel's free hand grasped out at the air, space itself solidifying to the point he could run his fingers through it as though it was the surface of a calm lake. N0 VLUSB. C0M. Suddenly, his hand, which had been moving slowly, pressed down with great force. The gravity field's range expanded to double its original range. The carnage was devastating. From hundreds, thousands of dwarven race existences were compressed from the head to their feet, falling into condensed bags of meat. Aurora and Malkuhorn finally couldn't stay still any longer. They raised their bows, attacking in unison. They had a beautiful tacit understanding, their arrows spiraling around one another and suddenly fusing. They didn't seem to believe that Lionel could ignore any and all arrows. Unfortunately. Bang! Emperor's Edict. Lionel suddenly disappeared. The lockdown of his spatial force vanished, the siege towers having been rendered useless within the range of his Emperor's Edict. Lionel's slaughter only became more devastating. Every time he appeared, his gravity field only seemed to get stronger, its range getting wider and wider. It had never been this powerful before, but it seemed to be drawing on an endless store of energy, descending down toward the world as though the core of its plane of existence. The devastation of dying for simply being within range of a person began to fill the dwarven race with fear. Without their bows and arrows, their strength was far beneath that of their tiers. Even those well into the middle tiers of the 7th dimension, and even some of the higher tier, couldn't last a single strike against Lionel. For the first time since the domain war began, one of the other races seemed to see the downside of their actions. It had seemed that there would be nothing but benefits to gain in their future, at almost no cost to themselves. But now, although the number Lionel had killed was nothing more than a drop in the bucket, It was as though they could finally see their own mortality. Lionel's body spun, and the arc of his spear force seemed to gain a new sort of character to it. The line of a force art appeared around his feet. One stroke, then two, then three. His laughter filled the air as he seemed to be dancing all alone, each stroke of his spear force shooting out for dozens of meters, and cutting down those that managed to escape outside the range of his gravity field. The accumulation of his momentum seemed to be getting faster and faster and faster. The rumbling roar of a beast slowly crescendoed. Lionel's words seemed to echo in all of their ears. "My name is Lionel Morales. Welcome to the human domain." Roar. A towering violet dragon manifested from the foggy energy around Lionel. His spear swung, carrying the momentum of the world as it suddenly thrust forward. A trench was torn through the battlefield, the violet dragon roaring forth as it took out hundreds of dwarven race members a second. There was no escape, no refuge to take, no amount of togetherness and teamwork that could block it. Everyone in the line of Lionel's spear strike was wiped out, left without body and corpse, their final moments spent in awe. Bang! The butt of Lionel's spear slammed into the ground, his 10 stars growing another size as the light of day and night flickered back and forth. The current Lionel, just by virtue of his improved universal force, was on a completely different level. But when this was paired with his new lineage factor, he seemed to have become a beast in human skin. He turned his back on the battlefield as though he couldn't be bothered to fight anymore, as though his boredom had taken hold, and there was nothing left that could interest him. Aurora and Malkuhorn were infuriated. He had just pointed his spear at them and provoked them, before he entirely ignored their presence. However, what could they do with their archery being useless? Without it, they weren't much more powerful than their race members. Even so, it was impossible for them to do nothing. "Rise!" Malkuhorn roared. The siege towers whirred to life, a beam of light connecting them in a line. Malkuhorn swapped his bow for a staff, using it as the center to connect the siege towers before pointing it down toward Lionel. Lionel had put in a lot of work to clear out the surrounding dozens of meters around him, but this only made things more convenient. They could target him without harming any of their own. However, at that moment, Lionel suddenly looked back. Malkuhorn couldn't see his face, but he still felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Your little siege towers. I've already figured them out." Lionel suddenly vanished, appearing atop a siege tower in an instant. Malkuhorn frowned before relaxing. Approaching a siege tower was maybe the most foolish thing a person could do. Lionel's actions now were akin to trying to attack a fortified city wall, with nothing more than a fist. However, Lionel only raised a hand and snapped his fingers. It was a snap that echoed much further than it should have. The ground beneath the siege tower trembled, and some sort of rhythm seemed to have been disrupted. The beam that had been accumulating on Malkuhorn's staff vanished as Lionel casually swung his spear blade down. The siege tower, meant to be indestructible and unmovable, was split in two down to the base, a blood mess falling to the ground as well as the dwarven race members within collapsed along with it. Lionel raised his spear once again and rested it on his shoulder, softly landing on the ground. The cannons of the starship took aim and the entire dwarven race felt exposed. Chapter 2138. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 2138. Ancestor. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aurora and Malkuhorn were shaken by what they had just seen. There were without a doubt ancestors hiding likely in plain sight, but all of them had similar reactions. They didn't understand what it meant for Lionel to simply snap his fingers, and for their highly touted formations to just collapse as though they were never a big deal. What they didn't know was that Lionel had been getting familiar with the dwarven race's force arts for over a year now already. His first exposure to them was within a subdimensional zone, and it went to show why existences like the Silver Empire went so far out of their way to distort their zones. Lionel had actually gotten so much information out of what was essentially a lingering remnant of the dwarven race long since past. What Lionel learned in that zone was twofold. First, he had learned that zones were almost entirely constructed of dream force, A realization that laid the foundation for his sudden understanding that everything around him now was nothing more than a simulation. The second thing he had learned was a concept that resided with him to this day, and that was the concept of resonance. Resonance was an ethereal concept that was difficult to grasp, but just by understanding tidbits of it, Lionel was able to do a great deal. He was able to amplify his battle strength when fighting alongside Aina. He was able to bring his spear force to the current level, and most importantly to the given situation. He was able to grasp the weakness of the dwarven race. The dwarven race loved to build underground. They had a fascination with being close to earth and nature, and their force arts were built upon this. The reason their traps and defensive measures were so great was because they could resonate with the very ground they stood upon, and pull upon both its strength and its concealment. This made the dwarven race's force arts incredibly powerful, and it had also allowed them to resist the invasion of other races. However, before Lionel, who both had a deep understanding of force arts and an earth force affinity that was quickly flying off the charts, they were worth nothing more than a snap of his fingers. While Lionel couldn't dispel all dwarven race constructs so easily, the siege towers were especially vulnerable to him. That was because their foundation was compromised for the sake of gaining mobility. They simply stood no chance against him. The cannons began to glow and were already prepared to fire. However, it was then that the ancestors of the dwarven race couldn't seem to sit still any longer. There was a very obvious tacit understanding amongst those participating in this war. So long as the ancestors of one side didn't appear, neither would the ancestors of the other side. However, with their army facing extinction in the face of these laser cannons, what choice did the dwarven race have? They could only attack. But to their surprise, their action didn't receive the sort of retaliation they were expecting. It was as though the ancestors of the Void Palace Elders hadn't appeared just yet, nowhere to be seen in one of the most crucial times. The disciples of the fortified city all paled at once. They thought they had a clear grasp of the situation because Lionel had stopped them from retreating. Of course, the elders wouldn't be present to help stop this situation, because they likely already expected to sacrifice a number of them in exchange for giving up the city. The dwarven race ancestors immediately spread out into a formation of their own, their gazes steely as they prepared to block the coming lasers. They didn't have the luxury to guess at why the Void Palace Elders hadn't appeared just yet, because even a single starship was a huge threat to an ancestor, let alone a pair of them like this. That said, not all of them were like this. Taking advantage of the situation, one peeled off from the group, his gaze malevolent as his wings flapped, bringing him near Lionel in the blink of an eye. He didn't even bother to use his bow and arrow, not knowing whether Lionel had a method to dispel even his. Instead, he wanted to end this matter as swiftly as possible. A sixth-dimensional existence capable of killing seventh-dimensional geniuses, as though they were trash? That was unacceptable enough. He couldn't allow such a genius to grow in another race. He didn't know whether Lionel was responsible for the collapse of his formation. In his eyes, this must have been something the human race as a whole had figured out recently. After all, the dwarven race was well aware of the danger that the zones they had left behind posed. They just hadn't expected for the humans to find a method of dealing with them through it. In Zero Velas B. C0 MIF, he had known that Lionel had figured it all out on his own. Nothing would change. At most, his killing intent would be even sharper, but he was already going all out to kill Lionel as soon as possible so that none could interfere. Lionel sent a gaze toward the oncoming ancestor. Unlike normal sixth-dimensional existences, he was capable of sensing this sort of speed clearly, and his speed of thought was fast enough to keep up. Unfortunately, his body was not. The gap between the sixth and seventh dimensions was already enormous, let alone the gap between the seventh and eighth. This man didn't just seem to be in tier 1 of the latter either. Even so, Lionel remained exceptionally calm, unmoving. The ancestor believed that this was because Lionel didn't even realize he was in danger yet, but at that moment a palm suddenly manifested from thin air, appearing right before the ancestor. The ancestor was taken off guard and hurried to defend, striking out with a palm of his own. Bang! His figure shuddered, and he was sent flying back dozens of meters before he stopped in the air. From afar, A woman with flowing golden hair and sharp green eyes stood on the bow of a ship, looking down toward the battlefield. Chapter 2139. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 19 seconds AM. Chapter 2139. Glow. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Boom. 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 The lasers collided with the formation of the elders in the skies. They all grit their teeth defending against the volley. At the same time, the pair of prince and princess hurriedly commanded a retreat, having no choice but to leave behind the siege tower that Lionel had split in two. After a small bit of hesitation, Lionel didn't follow after them, his gaze only narrowing. He was truly aware now of the scale of these wars. Unless he was supremely powerful, it was impossible to make a dent against so many people. He must have killed thousands already, but that wasn't even 0.1% of the enemy's army. They were simply an endless swarm. His own army didn't get a chance to be very effective because the dwarven race was simply too decisive. Normally, another race might be too arrogant to throw out their ancestors just because a sixth-dimensional existence was stirring trouble. But this must be why the dwarven race had managed to survive for so long despite their weakness. They were decisive, they weren't scared of being called cowards, and they cared for their own. For the current Lionel, this was the most troublesome type of opponent because they were too cautious. The moment they felt that things were going left, they vanished. Even the ancestor that had attacked him, after his mother had forced him into a retreat, he vanished without a trace as well, not even trying a follow-up attack. Ultimately, the losses for the dwarven race were more than acceptable. They had exchanged basically a few thousand lives in exchange for breaching the first line of defense, and causing no small bit of damage to the structure of the second. They would probably regroup and prepare for another attack, or try to benefit off the back of another race's attack. Lionel looked down at the siege tower beneath him, his gaze flickering with some thoughts. In his preparation for war, he had created quite a number of things. The armors, or what he called the linked resonation armors, were only just one of these numbers. He had also created his own siege towers. The segmented cube made these matters so much easier on him since he only needed to create one and provide the resources while Anastasia handled everything else. But one thing he had neglected in their creation was the possibility of incorporating the force arts of the dwarven race. This siege tower might give him some clues toward improving it. He tossed the siege tower into the segmented cube, then threw these matters to the back of his mind. Then he ordered his subordinates to return before looking toward the disciples of the Void Palace. Return to the city, I don't want to hear talks of retreat. The disciples hesitated, but then they looked toward the woman on the bow of the ship. They didn't recognize her by face, but they could guess who she was, and they had all heard the rumors about what had happened at the air wars. This woman should be Lionel's mother, and with her here, even if Lionel's intention was to betray the Void Palace, there really wasn't much of anything they could do. The gap between their dimensions was far too steep. Even if the current Lionel was in Tier 9 of the 7th instead of the 6th, no one would just assume that he would be able to battle an ancestor. To put this matter into perspective, if Lionel had the means of an ancestor, it wouldn't take him decades to kill an army of billions. A few hours would probably be enough. The gap was impossible to fathom. Like this, everyone returned to the city obediently, and Lionel began to take inventory of everything. Of course, this wasn't for resources, but to rather understand what he could make do with and what was useless about the city's defenses. This was only one city of many. He couldn't just stay here. And there were likely other cities that had received the retreat order. If he was too slow, the entire second line would collapse, and by then, a single city would be useless. The second line of defense had by far the most cities of them all. The first line only had 3 cities, but the second line had 9, while the third line of defense was just the Void Palace, which, though large, technically just counted as one, though no one would really see it that way. There were certain advantages. The first was that the cities were connected by teleportation platforms, and these platforms could accommodate large amounts of people at once, up to 1 million at once without issue. Of course, 1 million was a drop in the bucket in a war of this scale, but it was much better than others. And 0 VOUSB. C0M Lionel, though, didn't plan on relying on this. Although it wouldn't be instant, he could transport more people at great speed with his starships. Then he suddenly had an idea and grinned. Such a large teleportation platform, it would be a shame if he didn't use it. Back on Earth, he had dropped a city from the city relying on a force art similar to this one. Although he had completed so many great things since then, that still felt like a crowning achievement of sorts. Wouldn't it be a shame if he peaked so early? Wouldn't it be embarrassing if the coolest story he could tell had happened when he was still a teenager? He was a grown man now, but he wasn't old yet. He still had some youth in these bones. Lionel grinned wildly. His mind swirled with thoughts of the dwarven race force arts, his new comprehension of spatial force, his self-created Lotus domain. Then he thought about how this formation was quite unique in the fact that it could only teleport precisely to 9 locations, those being the other 8 cities, and the final being the Void Palace itself. Lionel double-checked and realized that there was truly no way for him to make it to all 8 cities at the same time. That was when his eyes began to glow, his dream force flourishing. Chapter 2140. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 18 seconds AM. Chapter 2140. Pure radiance. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked like a madman. He stood before the empty teleportation platform, while everyone else remained idle. He must have stood staring into space for what was at least 10 minutes. This was really only a small period of time, but in this kind of war where everyone felt as though they were sitting on tenterhooks, it was far too long. For Lionel, this sort of time was even longer. His dream force had experienced 3 enormous leaps during the course of the Air Wars, each time his ability index increased with it. But none was more exaggerated than after his future self seemed to connect with his current self. It was as though all of the shackles that had been holding him down were crushed into ashes all at once. For the current Lionel, thinking for 10 minutes without any other thoughts was akin to another person thinking for years. It was truly that exaggerated. In the past, Wise Star Order had been able to counter his split minds and speed of thought with pure speed of thought of his own. But the current Wise Star Order couldn't hold a candle to Lionel. And at the moment, even ancestors couldn't think even a fraction of a percent as quickly as Lionel could. For Lionel to spend an entire 10 minutes on this problem, it could only be said that it was the greatest project of his life. The problem with what he was trying to do was the fact that he only had access to one of the 9 formations. He couldn't do anything to the others. If he had access to all 9, it would be far easier, but because he didn't, he had to use the spatial tunnel that connected them all to transpose the changes in real time. He couldn't do this ahead of time, or else it would alert others and introduce variables. He had to do it such that everything would move in unison, at once, completing in the shortest time possible and executing all at once. And 0 VLUSB. C0 at the same time. The movement through the spatial tunnels would introduce deviations, distortions and margin of error. He had to account for this and correct it, but this was a tall task not just due to the insane distances that were in question, but also the biggest elephant in the room, anarchic force. While it seemed that Lionel had reached the point where he could ignore anarchic force, this couldn't have been further from the truth. The reality was that he hadn't noticed a significant dip in his strength only because this was the second line of defense. If he had been at the first, he would have probably experienced at least a 10% dip. And with how things were even in the second line, the further one's attacks or force in general traveled through anarchic force, the larger chance there would be for it to suddenly collapse. In order to account for this, Lionel had to wrap his calculation in a complex lotus pattern, like a transfiguration for his force that would account for the chewing up of anarchic force, and leave behind just enough that everything would go perfectly. He couldn't make these defenses too solid, or else there would be too much, and he couldn't make them too weak, or else there would be too little. This was the reality of what Lionel was facing. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that it was the toughest problem he had ever faced. And yet, in the face of such a problem, he was already grinning ear to ear in just 10 minutes. Lionel began to move. The first thing he did was stomp a foot, hard, shattering everything in his path and seemingly ruining the formation before him. But those thoughts only seemed to last for a moment before it became clear that the formation was untouched and undamaged. The only change was that the enormous platform had begun to sink into the earth. Many paled when they saw this. For one, this was their only route out, but the second issue here was that, wasn't Lionel's Earth Force affinity a bit too high? It was well known that Earth Force was one of the hardest forces to use at a high level, not because it was any more unruly than others, but rather because the higher the dimension of the world you were in, the more sturdy the ground and the more unmovable the earth was. This matter was even more exaggerated in a world filled with anarchic force. And yet here was Lionel, casually stomping his foot, and causing a platform kilometers in diameter to sink into it. It was ridiculous. Only Lionel knew how far he had come. The first time he stepped foot into the Void Palace, he couldn't even leave a white mark on a mere tree trunk, let alone take mastery over the earth. But now, the cracks in the earth began to become thicker. Not only did they become thicker, but they became more organized and mysterious. Just looking at them, people felt as though their souls were being sucked out from their eyes. It was a magical feeling that couldn't be described. And then these lines solidified. The moment the earth stopped rumbling, the teleportation platform began to grow on its own. Large swaths of anarchic force being dispelled as pure force moved forward, filling the trenches created by Lionel's stomp. It was then that it clicked. Those trenches. They were a large force art. By this point, the teleportation platform had already sunk deep into the earth for what must have been at least 10 meters. As it did so, all of the force in the surroundings surged toward it, growing thicker and thicker until the point of a dense white fog was covering the top of the teleportation platform and completely obscuring it from view. It was unlike anything anyone here had ever seen. It looked like the force was just moments away from becoming a dense liquid. And then the entire city began to rumble. Lionel tilted his head up into the skies and began to laugh. A wild pillar of energy surged out and pierced into the skies. At that moment, all 8 of the remaining cities were in a heated retreat. Many of those in the vanguard were being slaughtered wantonly. The dwarven race could be considered the weakest of these invading races, so one could imagine the kind of devastation the others were facing currently. If Ronan's orders had been followed, this sort of slaughter would have been levied against the people of Lionel's fortified city. But they were spared this fate while the others weren't so lucky. The spirits of the invading races were high and filled with disdain while the humans had hit rock bottom. It seemed that there would only be death or enslavement in their future. Until their cities began to rumble and suddenly gave off an enormous pillar of light. One after another, their teleportation platforms sunk into the earth and exploded with force, deep trench marks identical to the ones Lionel had created taking shape one after another. The ground shook and quaked. Then in a shocking scene, all of the anarchic force in the region seemed to be pushed away, expelled like waste blocked by a barrier of pure radiance. Chapter 2141. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 2141. Semi-ring. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The sudden change shocked many. The dispelling of anarchic force wasn't rare. It was something that all those at the top echelon of various domains were capable of. Though it took effort and many resources, it wasn't impossible so long as the anarchic force was beneath a certain threshold of concentration. Lionel himself had been to many places capable of doing this, like the Spear faction of the Void Palace as one example. But for it to happen here, on the second line of defense, and on such a large scale as well and seemingly completely randomly, it was a shocking change for many on the battlefield. And what was more important than even that was that it seemed that the shift of anarchic force wasn't a simple matter at all. Rather, it seemed that this was just the byproduct of what was really happening. The cities suddenly began to absorb a large amount of force, and it was this rushing influx of force that was pushing the anarchic force away. It was then that a shocking realization settled in. The purpose of this commotion wasn't to shift the anarchic force at all. Rather, the true purpose was so volatile and taking place on such a large scale that it had formed a perfect semi-ring of anarchic forceless region that completely changed the landscape of the battlefield. And then it happened. The rumbling of the cities reached an apex and a strong fluctuation of spatial force began to accumulate. As the cities continued their loud commotion, it was as though the entire world was shaking. The vibrations of the earth seemed to hit a perfect tone, like the sharp voice of a soprano treble echoing into shapely glassware. The city and the earth shook as one, each amplifying the other until they reached a crescendo. Fear took hold of the faces of several, both human and not. It felt like the entire world was coming to an end as one of the most dangerous forces in existence, spatial force, continued to increase in concentration. If this amount of spatial force suddenly went out of control, what it could cause was simply beyond imagining. Spatial ripples would be the least of one's concerns. Fissures in reality, cracks in the void. Even the sudden onset of true black holes wasn't impossible. If any one of these things occurred, there would only be death waiting for them all. But at that moment, just when things had reached their greatest height, everything came to a grinding halt. The rumbling slowed, the pillars of light gently dispersed, and the quaking cities solidified upon their foundations once again. It was as though the world had regained its peace, however. The clear semi-ring of dispersed anarchic force remained like the dividing line between heaven and hell. It was then that many sighed a slight hint of relief, but their curiosity couldn't help but spike. Just what had happened here? Some races were trapped within the semi-ring, but the vast majority of them had retreated out of the range. As for the human race, they were the exact reverse, having been stuck in the middle of a retreat from the very start. But now even they were wondering what was going on, and just what had happened exactly. Unable to withhold their curiosity any longer, some attempted to approach the semi-ring of anarchic forceless regions. However, when their hands tried to pass through, they were suddenly frozen solid. Their hands, they couldn't pass them through. Even after putting in more effort, they couldn't seem to pass through at all. At the same time, those on the opposite side, on the side of the humans, fell right through. But to their shock, their bodies suddenly began to stretch as though they had entered a black hole. They didn't even feel any pain until they suddenly no longer felt anything at all. Dead. They were all dead. The hearts of those that hadn't had the courage to go forward lurched. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. How could seventh-dimensional existences die after just touching a formation for a split moment? How could they not even have the chance to resist? It was then that the races stuck on the human race side of the barrier realized that they were truly trapped. There was no going back. They could either be obediently captured, or they would die to the last man. And Zero Velasp. See Zero Moss for the races stuck on the invaders' side. They didn't have a quick method of moving forward at all. Ancestors started to come forward, and many attacked the barrier in full force, only for their expressions to change when they realized that even they couldn't make a dent. When had the human race gained such a protective mechanism? What was happening? The man who had made it all happen was still grinning, but the fatigue on his face was evident. He breathed heavily, his mind feeling as though it had been drained to the last drop. But even then, he could feel himself quickly recovering at a speed that had been entirely impossible. Even so, he took a step forward, landing in the middle of the enormous, sunken teleportation platform. Force swirled around him, and suddenly his image was projected to all 9 of the cities, his grinning face appearing in the skies above the void battlefield. "Welcome, welcome," Lionel said with a light chuckle. "You all may not know me, but that time will come soon. Don't worry about this for now. I just have a little message for my fellow humans. This barrier will hold for 3 days. In that period, any attacks that come from our side will be concentrated and amplified. Your cannons will be easily 5 to 10 times more powerful than usual. I would suggest that you use this time to attack." Lionel spoke with a leisurely smile on his face, but his words were surprisingly sinister. At that moment, a starship had already suddenly appeared before a fortified city. Before it, there was an ancestor of the cloud race testing the strength of the barrier before himself. However, after throwing a punch, the world suddenly fell into silence. The starship fired a single time and the ancestor froze, his body slowly falling backward and hitting the ground. Dead. Chapter 2142. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 2142. Ideas. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's laughter echoed through the void battlefield. He seemed to take the death of an ancestor as a practical joke. The most shocking part of the attack was that the laser beam had started off wide and thick. But the moment it passed through the semi-ring anti-anarchic force barrier, it was stretched so thin that it became entirely invisible on the other side. It seemed that the stretching of the races that had entered the barrier wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Not only could it prevent those races from running away and forcing them to accept their punishment at the hands of the humans that now suddenly completely outnumbered them, but it could also be used to enhance laser attacks, and any force-based attacks for that matter. Lionel had clearly taken inspiration from the end of the Air Wars to design this barrier. Why just have a barrier that could only allow attacks from one side when you could have a barrier that only allowed attacks from one side and amplified those attacks as well? It was only after the ancestor collapsed to an attack, he couldn't even see properly, that a small dot in the middle of his forehead was noticed. On that day, the first ancestor had fallen in the world, and the backdrop to his death was the laughter of a young man barely in his mid-20s. The shock that this caused spread across the battlefield, and the other races quickly retreated. "Why are you running?" Lionel asked, jeering the invaders. "You all came with such fierce momentum. Don't leave like this. I've been looking forward to meeting you all for so long." The fury of the invading races seemed to reach an all-new height. They had never thought that they would come here just to be humiliated. The truly horrendous part of all of this was that the matters of one battlefield couldn't travel to another instantaneously, and definitely not faster than Lionel's starships. Before even a few minutes was up, 8 ancestors of various races had fallen, each one as tragically at the last, and each one regretting that they didn't take Lionel's near-maniacal laughter more seriously. And 0 Valusb. C0M. The human race was stunned as they watched the other races flee, their frustration and agitation of the last day, or so, being reflected back to them in a way that had never felt more satisfying than now. It was like they had finally gained space to breathe. However, when they remembered that this would only last for 3 days, though their moods didn't completely dampen, they cooled a great deal. Looking up at the face in the skies, they didn't need to guess that it was Lionel that had somehow made all of this possible. "Fortify your cities," Lionel commanded, changing the resonance of his voice so that it couldn't be heard past the barrier. "Don't retreat. Anyone who retreats now I will kill personally. That is a promise. The human race has more backbone than this, act like it." The blood of the Void Palace disciples began to boil, and they roared one after another, rushing toward the straggling other race members and killing them one by one. This wasn't the kind of war they could take prisoners for. The only thing that was left was battle. Lionel disconnected and exhaled a breath, shaking his head. He was quite aware that he had just put a huge target on his back, but the smile on his face hadn't faded in the slightest. Aina appeared at the edge of the crater and shook her head. She really wanted to ask Lionel why he had revealed that this barrier would only last for 3 days, but she didn't know if this annoying man would actually answer her question. Lionel grinned, taking a step and appearing by her side. "What? Am I very handsome?" Aina rolled her eyes, barely passable. "I'll take it," Lionel laughed. "You don't need to wonder so much. They would figure it out anyway eventually. The barrier will definitely weaken over time. If I tried to play it off like we had more than 3 days, or even an infinite time, they wouldn't see it as strength, they would see it as a vulnerability. By candidly admitting that we only have 3 days, after the 3-day period is up they'll second-guess attacking immediately. How many ancestors are there in the whole dimensional verse? Maybe a few hundred? I doubt it's much more than 1,000 total, but 8 died today when maybe 8 have died in the past hundreds of years in totality. They'll definitely think twice before they make a move. It couldn't be helped. This method by Lionel was genius, but it was crude. He relied on the innate spatial force accumulating ability of the teleportation platforms, and then used the earth and concepts of the dwarven race to amplify this ability hundreds of folds over. But the problem with that was the fact that the platforms were taking the brunt of the punishment. These platforms were made with excellent, top-class, top-quality materials. They were rated to last thousands of years with minor maintenance. But now Lionel was burning through all of that durability in 3 days. It could be imagined the kind of pressure that was on these platforms currently. Aina could see that behind Lionel's confidence, there was a hint of a spinning wheel. It was clear that he didn't have a solution for all of this. He at best had a minor stopgap, but it was hard to say how things would turn out in the end. He had given the human domain 3 days, so hopefully the other families would show up. The problem, however, was that the Void Palace was clearly compromised. It was hard to say what would happen. In fact, very soon, it might be the case that the Void Palace might try to come here to stir trouble, or they might ignore him directly out of fear of his father, and target the other families before they could even appear. This matter would definitely be troublesome. However, Lionel was still Lionel. He had his own ideas. Chapter 2143. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:54 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 2143. Treasured son, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The dwarven race didn't know exactly what had happened. They had no idea how lucky they were that they had gotten off so easily. The other races all lost at least one ancestor, while some had even lost 2, with the worst being the beast domain, which had lost 3. In their ignorance, they were quite enraged by what had happened, but they were also hesitant. They were the weakest of the races aside from the humans themselves, and they had only attacked because they felt that it would be an easy way to gather more resources and strengthen themselves. They were well aware that their current strategy of remaining holed up in their domain and constantly defending against outside attacks couldn't last forever. They would suffer greatly eventually if they weren't also improving. The only race that could afford to rest on their laurels was the spirituals. They didn't have such luxury. An ancestor of the dwarven race, Ancestor Barrows, looked toward another, an Ancestor Rankin, with a questioning look. Ancestor Rankin was the very same ancestor that had tried to quickly kill Lionel during the commotion. He was being questioned about what he had experienced. It was a powerful attack. I didn't feel like I could resist. But I don't understand it well. She attacked from at least 10 kilometers away. Through anarchic force, her strength is not small. If she was closer, she could have very well killed me. Ancestor Barrows and the other ancestors looked quite serious. Against such a powerful ancestor-level being, the dwarven race was at a disadvantage, especially if that child's ability to negate bow force could be extended toward them as well. More importantly, that brat who destroyed our siege tower. How is that he can dispel bow force? Isn't the bow domain ring with the spirituals? How is this possible? This is something beyond even the bow domain ring. The bow domain ring can only dispel bow force targeted toward the person in question. But this child can dispel bow force in a wide range, almost as though it's a domain of sorts. Is it an ability index? It must be. There doesn't seem to be any other explanation. It's just unfortunate that this is a perfect counter to our race's strength. I think we should consider our next step very carefully. The ancestors fell into silence and subconsciously looked toward Ancestor Barrows. This man's opinion was highly respected, as he was the one who had convinced them all to take part in this war. It was in their nature to defend and hole up, so one could imagine the kind of influence this man had to convince their entire race to go against their usual stand. Before Ancestor Barrows could say anything, the princess of their race, Aurora, rushed in. Greetings, ancestors. I've received a message from Gregwin, prince of the nomad race. There's a meeting of the races taking place to discuss the human race. The expressions of the dwarven race's people jumped. This wasn't something they had expected. Had something happened? What kind of change could warrant this sort of response? Not long later, Ancestor Barrows entered a circle of ancestors. The nomad race, the Rapax race, the beast domain, the cloud race, they were all here. The appearances of the nomad, Rapax and cloud race could be imagined, but the beast domain ancestor was different, as one might expect. The beast domain's representative was a 3-headed serpent beast. It had a huge body, spanning almost 20 meters in length. The section its 3 heads connected to thumped with the echo of a raging river. Every time its tongue slithered, a harsh whistling sound would fill the air. and it felt as though all the oxygen in the surrounding dozens of kilometers was taken over by it. The beast domain was really known as a wild zone. It wasn't controlled by any single type of beast, but rather had a myriad of races within them. However, each ancestor that was born among them was allowed to take over a region of their own, and this became their governing bodies. They didn't cooperate in anything but war because they all felt that more territory would only benefit them. However, having lost 3 ancestors already, it could be imagined that they were entirely enraged. However, this made what happened next all the more infuriating. The Rapax will not be participating in this matter any longer. The language of the Rapax was just as grating on the ears as usual, but it seemed to be perfectly translated in the ears of the ancestors present. N0 Velusby. C0M without any hesitation. The beast domain's representation raised its 3 heads and roared, its fury causing the skies above to churn. Ancestor Barrow's expression changed and he retreated. He wasn't the only one who retreated, but he was definitely the one that had the fastest. The Rapax ancestor, however, didn't move. In fact, he waited for the 3-headed serpent beast to stop roaring before he swept it a casual glance, and then turned to leave. Wait. The beast domain ancestor roared, its voice sounding like rumbling thunder clouds. Why you retreat? Its speech was very simple, and its language was nothing but a mixture of roars and grunts. But the point got across clearly enough. Because our race's treasured son does not want to participate any longer, the Rapax said calmly before vanishing over the horizon. The other races were stunned. The Rapax put so much stock in the words of their prince? If they understood correctly, this boy was barely over 20 years of age as well. The others looked toward one another, but it was clear they had no intention to retreat. They didn't know what the Rapax were doing, but this wasn't enough to sway them. That said, aside from the beast domain, the Rapax were the most suited to being the vanguard. Even so, with the rage of the beast domain representative seemed clear enough. This could be used. The nomad and cloud race ancestors looked toward one another, their thoughts unreadable. Chapter 2144. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:53 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 2144. Could it be? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The choice of the Rapax didn't make sense to the remaining ancestors. Their greater hatred told them that the Rapax were just cowards, but the much greater reason told them that this was absolute nonsense. The Rapax were a warring race. They were constantly attacking all of the domains at once. In truth, they were a bit of an eyesore due to this, however they were so difficult to deal with that none of the domains had taken action until now. There was no race that was more prepared for war than the Rapax. From youth, they were birthed on the battlefield, and from the moment they took their first breaths they had already begun to acclimate to anarchic force, whereupon by the time they were mature, they were practically entirely immune. It also didn't help that they were entirely undetectable through usual sensory methods. Due to all of this, they were a race unafraid of provocation and loss. They were probably the least moved by the loss of their ancestors. So why were they retreating? Even with all of this being laid out before them, the ancestors simply didn't have a reason. They had no idea what had happened all those years ago. And maybe to them, even if they did know, they could never connect these two matters because it was simply too ridiculous. After a moment, the ancestors of the cloud race and the nomad race spoke. Even without the Rapax, this matter can't be ignored. The human domain cannot be allowed to produce an 8th-dimensional world and advance within it. If these words were to echo in Lionel's ears, it was unknown how he would react. All this while, his assumptions toward why it was the human domain was being attacked was quite benign and normal. An 8th-dimensional world provided a world of resources. These other domains might not care about 7th-dimensional worlds because they had too many, but 8th-dimensional worlds, the pinnacle of the dimensional verse, were another animal entirely. However, these words seem to imply that this wasn't a war for resources, but rather an attempt to stop the humans from growing any further. But this didn't make any sense. In terms of geniuses and overall combat strength, these races were far beyond that of humans, so much so that when it was 1-to-1, Humans would almost always lose against other races with the exception of the dwarven race. Even so, we will have to wait 3 days. Don't you think it's odd that this boy would make it so clear that it was 3 days? What's his purpose? It might be to lure us into a trap. It's possible that in 3 days they will control that mysterious formation to vanish. And then when we've let our guard down, they'll spring another trap, the nomad ancestor said coldly. How could your spies not know about this? The cloud race's expression was somewhat ugly when he heard this question. What is it? My race's members have been dying one after another in quick succession. Also, not a single one has sent reports about this formation. From the information I was fed before this war began, it's impossible for the humans to have such a measure, and it's even more impossible that it would be so well hidden. From my understanding, the greatest threat is, without a doubt, the Omen family's new starships, and one has already appeared on the battlefield. No news, that's impossible. Might I ask what is going on here? Ancestor Barrows finally interjected, his brows locked into a frown. Even if these two looked down on the dwarven race, speaking as though he wasn't here after inviting him here was too ridiculous. No? It was one thing for the somewhat slow and unintelligent beast domain race ancestor to not speak, but shouldn't they try and integrate him into the conversation? The cloud race and nomad race ancestors looked over. They instinctually wanted to ignore the question, but they had already decided to invite the dwarven race. So they were needed. They quickly explained things, but the more Barrows heard, the more ridiculous he felt it was. But then, he thought of a certain body. My race was forced to retreat before these things occurred, so I was unaware. However, we experienced something similarly baffling. One of our siege towers was destroyed by a boy, likely the same boy you are speaking about. Indeed, he did say his name was Lionel Morales as well. The two ancestors were frowning, but when they heard this they suddenly jolted awake. They had subconsciously ignored Lionel's name, because they couldn't be bothered to give a sixth-dimensional existence the time of day. They all inwardly believed that Lionel was just the proxy for the actions of someone else, and had ignored his name. But suddenly hearing it again, they linked it to another man. Velasco Morales. Their expressions turned serious. And C0M the reason they were taking the human race so seriously was because they were aware of the potential of the humans. Their efforts were scattered and unfocused, so they were weak, but that didn't mean that it would always be like this. Lionel wasn't the only one who felt that the human race and the spirituals were far too similar for it to be a coincidence. But if there had to be a second reason, it was definitely that man who had been rampaging across the dimensional verse as though it was his own backyard, acting as he pleased without a care in the world. The Morales name was of no consequence to them. They knew them as a family with a seventh-dimensional lineage factor. However, that had recently changed with the eruption and formation of their family's constellation. However, according to their understanding of that man, he didn't work with others. Ever. But would he be so callous toward his own son? From what they knew years ago, he had caused a commotion in order to save his wife's life. Could it be that woman had birthed him a child? Chapter 2145. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:53 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 2145. Idle. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The expressions of the ancestors continuously changed, and soon they became unprecedentedly determined. The silent beast domain ancestor growled, its scales lifting up as though they were peeling before settling back down. It looked as though it was breathing through its skin. They seemed to have made a decision right then and there. At that moment, Lionel wasn't idle. Much like the cloud ancestor had said, before he did anything else, he went through every human, painstakingly, one by one. Every time he found a cloud race member, he slaughtered them without mercy. And C0M there was a limit to how many people he could control with his seals, and the cloud race was too skilled in these matters. He had to take his own cautions. After he had resurrected Maya after her death, she was far more obedient than she had been in the past, but this didn't make Lionel relax. If anything, it made him more attentive. It made sense for someone to change after experiencing death, but it was when things seemed the most calm that the greatest caution needed to be taken. Maya had never been so close to the Cloud Race's core since she began her mission. In addition, her uses to Lionel currently were limited. She was a great power in the air wars, but she was ultimately of little consequence here. The first day passed in a blaze, and it was only at its tail end that Lionel finally finished expunging the front lines of the Cloud Race. The harsh reality of this, though, was that once the other families came, it would infuse the army with another huge load of them. It was an infestation that would never give out. However, halfway through the second day, Lionel's expression was quite dark. These families that he was preparing for hadn't appeared at all. At first, Lionel had understood how slow they were being. After all, not all of them had had the luxury to come here directly from the air wars like he had. They had affairs to get in order, and defenses to set up in case the final lines of defense were breached, and the invaders poured into the human domain. But a day should have been enough. After that day, especially given the urgency of the messages that were sent out, they should have already appeared the day after. However, he was well into the second day after his arrival, and he hadn't seen a single shadow of even a single one of them. He thought that maybe the Void Palace had done something. This wasn't impossible, but then he shook his head. The current Void Palace should be in a peculiar state. It was obvious to Lionel that there were traitors, but it wasn't the same for everyone else. It was also in the Void Palace's best interest that they keep up this FAA sectionade of being still on the side of good, which was why they hadn't done anything even after their orders for retreat were directly ignored. If they did something as ridiculous as command the large families to not come, they would definitely be exposed. But on an even deeper level than that, wouldn't they prefer those families to come? If the Void Palace was under the control of traitors, their goal was obviously to deal a blow to the human domain. If those families were scattered, how would they deal with them all at once? That might even be why the traitors had allowed the urgency message to be sent out about the first line of defense being breached. And yet now, those families had yet to appear. Lionel's gaze was practically spitting fire. He might have reacted with a cold sneer if it was just the usual suspects. But he, the patriarch of the Morales family, was currently standing on the front lines, facing off against the enemies of the human domain. And yet, the family he supposedly led was nowhere to be seen. He didn't receive a message. There was no communication, not even an attempt at once. It was as though they didn't feel the need to explain themselves to him. Lionel's gaze flickered with a crimson glow, an eerie grin spreading across his face. The second day came to an end, and the weaknesses of the formation were already becoming clear. Whereas before it was impossible to push it even a single inch, those that were sent forward to test it, although meeting some resistance, could push forward a few feet before being repelled. Due to this, the races were able to confirm that Lionel hadn't been lying about the 3-day deadline, and they began to prepare. This wasn't something that could be faked. Lionel wasn't the only force art expert in existence. Although they couldn't replicate what he had done, or figure out exactly how he had done it, analyzing force arts was far easier than creating them. The third day began to be eaten into, and Lionel realized that not only would he not receive the reinforcements he thought he definitely would, but he wouldn't even receive a message from the family that he supposedly ruled over either. Chapter 2146. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:53 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 2146. A bit longer if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The Morales ancestors hadn't had even a moment of rest. The moment they felt they understood the situation, they had given up all thoughts of going to the Void battlefield, and instead began to spend night and day fortifying their defenses and learning the new landscape of their territory. It was extremely difficult, and there was chaos across their world. There were countless force eruptions day in and day out as the force in the atmospheres began to raise themselves to an 8th-dimensional standard. This caused the wild evolution of various plants and wildlife, not to mention the birth of new force crystal mines and other or deposits of the like that stimulated the greed of their people. They didn't even have time to think about Lionel. In fact, Lionel technically wasn't their patriarch, yet because the coronation ceremony had yet to take place. For all intents and purposes, Ataworth's father was still their patriarch. Even so, at the moment, even Patriarch Alejandro was nothing more than a figurehead at the moment, the reins of the family having been taken over by the ancestors. A large portion of the ancestors had split off to focus on researching the changes to their lineage factor, and how to quickly maximize the benefits that they could gain from it in the shortest amount of time possible. Using their knowledge and countless family records, they were already making great progress. It was lucky for them that the lineage factor seemed to have been amplified rather than mutated, or else the progress would have been even slower, and it would have taken an unknown number of decades and maybe even generations to figure everything out. However, after just 2.5 days, it felt to them that they had figured out about 20% of the new changes, and they were making faster progress the more they understood. Every time they made a large discovery, they released it immediately, knowing that there wasn't much time left. They wanted those that could take advantage of the changes to do so as soon as possible. As for the remaining ancestors, they were entirely focused on governance and policy. Namely, Ancestor Alvaro and Ancestor Isa took these reins. They didn't believe that it would take more than 2 ancestors to handle these matters. Ancestor Hito, as the most senior and knowledgeable, was entirely focused on researching their new lineage factor. Ancestor Alvaro and Isa were swift and decisive. They quelled greed with strict and even draconian policies. They directed large workshops of crafters to get to work on building defenses around their new 8th-dimensional world. And at the same time, they began to organize evacuation orders for the most vulnerable. They realized that defending their entire territory might be impossible as much as they wanted to. So while they set up strong defenses on the outer regions, they evacuated much of their population to the core regions of their territory. Trillions of Morales made their way swiftly, and it could be said that the organization was as good as it could be for such a large-scale migration. It was clear that the weight of an ancestor's words and appearance weren't small in the slightest. Whether it was the ancestors themselves, or even the citizens who had just been praising Lionel to the high heavens, none of them felt that this was odd. After all, Lionel was still young. It only made sense that such important matters would be handled at the whims of those that were by far his senior. This was just the way of the world. It was likely that no one expected that Lionel would be upset by this matter. Or maybe more accurately, they thought it would be ridiculous for him to feel such a way. "We haven't gone far enough." Ancestor Isa spoke in her usual cold tone. "We can't be too cruel to our own citizens, Isa." Ancestor Alvaro shook his head. "No, they aren't citizens, they are our family, no matter how distant. This family of ours has worked us to death in the last 2 days. Why haven't they realized we're family yet?" Alvaro didn't respond because he didn't have anything to refute with. This was true enough. The mob mentality of people in these sorts of situations was nothing short of annoying. Weren't they smart enough to realize that everyone would benefit very soon? And this wasn't the time for this? He shook his head before his eyes suddenly lit up as though he finally remembered something. "And 0 Velas B. C0M, right? We need to have someone call Littlest Nova back. It's a good time to hold the coronation ceremony and officially crown him as patriarch. ITLL help calm the people's hearts down. The more normal we can be, the better. He's an excellent uniting force. ITLL be easier to control the masses with him here. It's like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. We can also give him much of the credit for the organization of this matter. Give him a nice little boost to start his term." Ancestor Isa frowned. "Are we sure we want to do this?" "Do what?" Alvaro asked, confused. "This Lionel is just as unruly as his father, but he has ambition Velasco didn't have, and that makes him more dangerous. I'm afraid if we give him the family, he'll never want to give it back." Alvaro fell into silence before he shook his head. Breaking tradition now isn't worth it. Also, can he even do such a thing with us here? It's a worthless worry. When the ancestors speak to have him step down, what will he be able to say? Isa's gaze flickered, but this time it was her turn to remain silent. "Okay, well, wait a bit longer to call him back. Your words aren't without merit. He may need a little reminder of what the position of patriarch represents." Lionel looked up into the skies, standing silently. The third day's light was waning, and the formation was already beginning to flicker. Suddenly, the formation ring collapsed entirely and anarchic force began to rush forward. The third day had ended and there were no reinforcements in sight. Chapter 2147. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:53 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 2147. Assimilate. 1. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina appeared by Lionel's side. She knew him well enough to know why the smile had disappeared from his face, even if he didn't spell it out for her. After the matters related to what seemed like Lionel's future self, he had been entirely carefree. But in these last 3 days, he had become serious once more, entirely silent and unmoving. It felt like every time she looked for him, he was standing in this very spot. Without a word, Aina took Lionel's hand, looking out toward the failing formation. His hand felt sturdier than usual. It seemed as though, despite what his expression might show, he was still the same steady hand. This serious expression of his was nothing more than him keeping receipts, remembering this moment quite well. His impression of the Morales family was still overall quite good. It was probably difficult for old folk that had been doing things one way all their lives to suddenly change. It probably also had to be remembered that they were probably just as arrogant individually as Lionel was. After all, to step into the 8th dimension, which of them weren't the absolute geniuses of their era? In fact, the only reason they didn't get a fancy name like the Cataclysm generation was one because they hadn't experienced such a disaster, and second because in their day, only 1 or 2 of them appeared at a time. How could you name an entire generation when there were only a couple of stars among them? But this only made these ancestors even more arrogant. They were used to not having any opponents at all. In their view, in their youth, they were probably no worse than Lionel. They glanced over the details, ignoring the things that made them uncomfortable, and focusing on what gave them confidence. It was human nature, and something that even powerhouses of their stature weren't immune to. Ultimately, they still had the intention to crown Lionel their patriarch. They still saw him as a Morales. They still felt that he was the pride of their family. They only wanted to remind him that in the past, they too had once been the pride of the Morales family. The Lionel of today, in their eyes, was just a younger version of them. And yet, not only were there multiple of them, but they had had the time to grow and reach the extent of their potential. Why would they defer to a youth? Lionel understood all of this. He even felt that it made sense on some level if you ignored the details of what he had accomplished. He just didn't care. If his arrogance had been a vague, amorphous being that only partially directed his action in the past, right now it was like an oppressive, shining beacon that refused to be restrained. It was as though he was both the same, and an entirely different person at the same time. In the past, he might have been enraged because the Morales family didn't show him the due respect he deserved. Even when he was at his most docile, and the most lacking in ability, back then when he first met King Arthur, and casually took a knee to bow because he didn't care much. His limit of patience toward those who didn't give him his due respect was limited. But now, even this small slight of not even bothering to contact him was burning like an inferno within his heart. Even so, after a moment he grinned. In zero Vielusp. C0MIT was his first smile in 3 days. And as the barrier he had formed continued to weaken and the teleportation platform to his back began to crack and collapse in on itself, he spoke some words that didn't seem to make much sense at first. It would be a shame if the human domain didn't witness this matter, right? I can't have old fogies thinking that they can just be so casually compared to me, right? Lionel looked toward Aina, who looked back with a complicated look in her eyes. She didn't quite know how to feel. Her gaze was a cross between confusion, worry, and a hint of support, as though she was trying her best to put on a strong front. However, she couldn't hide the fact that hearing these words of everything come from Lionel in this matter had left her not quite knowing what to feel. However, when she saw the brightness in Lionel's gaze, it seemed to illuminate the darkness within her thoughts. It was as though a galaxy of violet was hidden within, expanding with the grandeur of the big bad and the beauty of a nebula that held the very kernels of life and future possibilities within them. Lionel's emperor's charm seemed to overflow out of his control, roaring with the arrogance of a mythical creature never before seen. With a thought, Lionel snapped his finger. At that moment, an echo flashed before quickly vanishing. A dispelled connection that had ended after the air wars concluded suddenly fired up once again, but this time it was of something entirely different. The projection of the second line of defense appeared, and to the shock of many of the powerhouse families who had more information than the general population, it was actually still holding on firmly. Lionel waved a hand, and the corpses of several ancestors fell to the ground. His eyes opened wide and his hair fluttered wildly. These were corpses that should have long since disintegrated, and yet they were laying at Lionel's feet. What others didn't know was that this had been a FAA section audit from the very beginning. And now, these dead ancestors had fell in the hands of Lionel Morales. The wild grin on his face became more menacing as his hair whipped about. He wasn't on the same level as ancestors? Was that so? There was nothing in this world above him. No one worthy to be compared to him. Emperor's command. Arise! Lionel roared. Chapter 2148. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:53 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 2148. Assimilate, too. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The 8 corpses before him trembled. A shuddering might came from Lionel's mind, and he even deployed his 10 stars. Day and night fluctuated to his back, the rushing impact of a roaring wave of dream force descending. His 3 dream force stars began to rotate so fast that harsh winds threatened to flatten the entire city. It felt as though the world was coming to an end. And yet the young man at the center of it all was at the mere 6th dimension. There was absolutely nothing that could have prepared the human domain for this. The death of 8 ancestors was already enough to shake them. Even after so long, they didn't quite believe what they were seeing. However, after a double take and a triple take, they had no choice but to believe what it was they were seeing before them. However, before they could even settle down to accept this sort of reality, these changes began to occur. What happened in the air wars suddenly shook them all awake. It couldn't be. It couldn't be that he would take control of their souls as well. At that moment, the impossible seemed to have become the exact opposite. The shadows of 8 ancestors took shape, each armored in gorgeous violet armor. One was a tiger beast, a menacing creature with teeth alternating between a dense black and a glowing, vibrant red. Its gaze flashed with endless killing intent, and when it lifted its large head to roar into the skies, the whole of the void battlefield seemed to be collapsing at the seams. The second was a rhino-type beast. It had 3 horns, each larger than the last, and aligned in a straight line up its nose. Its body shimmered with radiant silver scales, and even in death, it looked as though it could illuminate a night sky. As a soul, its radiant scales were mostly obscured, but this didn't dim its radiance at all. In fact, it only amplified it. The violet armor and silver scales seemed to have fused into one, acting in synergy with one another, and feeding off the strengths of one another. The third was a vulture. It was a grotesque, wrinkled creature from the neck up. And yes, from the neck down. Its majestic bearing seemed as though it could compete with any creature in all of existence. Its individual black feathers looked like they had been crafted by the most elite of artisans, carefully and individually. In its sole form, much of its grotesque head was obscured by its violet armor, and much like the rhino, the armor accentuated its body, giving it an elegant bearing that it had never had in life. These 3 were the 3 ancestors of the beast domain. The blood tiger ancestor, the radiant rhino, and the majestic vulture. However, they were just 3 of 8. There still remained 2 of the nomad race, 2 of the cloud race, and 1 of the rapax race. They looked just like the others of their races. The nomad ancestor, Ancestor Nadi, was an older woman but carried a beauty even in her elder age. All 6 of her hands were fair, delicate, and dainty, and yet they carried a strength that caused the air around her to tremble. She was the strongest of the 2. The cloud race ancestor, Ancestor Alfina, was yet another woman. Her cloud figure was the largest Lionel had ever seen. extending out from the back of her head like a long, flowing river of hair, filled to the brim with complex runes that would make even the strongest of crafters dizzy. She was also the strongest of the two. And finally, there was a Rapax ancestor, Ancestor Zypex. He stood tall at almost 3 meters. His tail looked like his spine had continued out from its back, covered in a metallic, silver skeletal structure. He stood on his digitigrade feet, his pill-shaped head splitting to reveal a glistening row of transparent, drool-covered teeth. Each and every one of these existences were legends of their races. But one after another, the instant they appeared, without even the slightest hesitation, they turned toward Lionel and bowed. Ancestor Zypex, Alfina, and the other humanoids all dropped to their knees. The Radiant Rhino Ancestor and the Blood Tiger Ancestors lowered their heads until their foreheads touched the ground. The Majestic Vulture Ancestor prostrated itself to the ground, even allowing its chest to press down. Emperor! They all roared out in their various languages, the echo of their voices echoing like a clap of thunder. The reverence in their eyes couldn't have been any clearer. Lionel waved a hand and the 8 of them immediately vanished. However, it was soon clear that they hadn't truly disappeared. Rather, they had moved so fast that the tracking system lost track of them for a moment. This was inevitable. Lionel had commandeered the projection method of the Morales, and it was designed to follow 7th dimension existences. How could it keep up? However, the one person who was easy to follow was Lionel. It was then that it was clear that Lionel had hopped into the cracking foundation of what remained of the teleportation platform, letting go of Aina's hand. N0 VLUSB. C0 MHE raised his hands and pressed them together. His Dream Force stars, which had calmed down, began to roar to life once again. Emperor's might. Assimilate. Chapter 2149. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:53 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 2149. Assimilate 3. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. At that moment, the images seemed to have finally caught up. The human domain realized that the ancestors hadn't vanished. They had moved exceptionally quickly, and their destination was actually the 8 remaining cities. When Lionel roared out, they too had appeared on the teleportation platforms of the 8 fortified cities with Lionel on the 9th. At that moment, the cracking teleportation platforms began to crumble even faster. But rather than this being a result of the crumbling formation, it became obvious that it was because of Lionel's actions. One after another, the residual force of the teleportation platforms surged into Lionel and his 8 ancestors' bodies. The weakening formation weakened even faster as this began to happen. But Lionel didn't seem panicked in the slightest. Emperor's command, Arise, was quite straightforward. It was able to take control of the souls of the dead and force them into submission. Depending on the stamina of the one who awoke them, they would basically be undead warriors, unfazed by injury and death and completely loyal to their emperor. It was a fearsome ability, and one that struck fear in the 4 great families. This alone was enough to explain the collapse of the Fox family. This sort of power was likely the kind of thing that even the spirituals wouldn't be able to remain idle in the face of. However, Emperor's command, Arise, was only one of 3. There was still Assimilate and Breathe. If Emperor's command, Arise, was able to handle the souls of the organic, Emperor's command, Assimilate, was able to handle the souls of the inorganic. Assimilate allowed Lionel to find the kernel of life within natural resources and take control of them. He could then assimilate with these resources, or allow those awakened by Arise to do so. When Lionel learned of this ability's capability, his entire expression changed. That was because it was simply too heaven-defying. Even if it was the case that it was temporary just like Arise was, the implications were massive. It had to be remembered that natural resources were where the inspiration for the life grade came from. Natural resources were akin to the universe's hand at crafting a life grade existence. It was seamless, perfect, and carried its own sort of life. This was why it was so dangerous for Lionel to have so little control over his Scarlet Star Force innate node. But Assimilate allowed Lionel to sense that kernel of specialness that made a natural resource unique, tap into it, and then extract it. Once he did, and he absorbed it to himself, he could gain the benefit of clarity that resource provided. It would cause a sharp spike in his affinity for it for a span of 24 hours, just like a rise. However, gaining affinity was just one of the possibilities. At that moment, the violet armor that covered the 8 ancestors began to warp and change. It was as though the ores of the teleportation platform were becoming a part of them, but not just that, they seemed to all connect them all across the cities. N0 via LUSP. C0M. This wasn't just an example of assimilate. Or rather, Lionel was applying it in a way that maybe no one of the Fox family ever had before. And if they had, it was something that could have only been accomplished by the most talented of them all. Not only was he integrating the remaining strength of the teleportation patterns into them, but he was also using their innate link to fuse the changes into one. To make something complicated simple, Lionel was creating the strongest linked armors he had ever created before. From the very beginning, Lionel had had this plan in his back pocket. It was rather that he didn't know if it was worth it to expose at this moment. But his rage had spilled over. Rather than letting the platforms run out of strength on their own, he changed his mind. He instead used assimilate on them, sucking in the last of their power. This was absolutely perfect because assimilate had its limits. If he had tried to assimilate them in the beginning, even the ancestors would have exploded and died, not to mention him. But now, it was absolutely perfect. The 8 ancestors raised their heads and howled into the skies. The other races were alerted to the sudden change immediately. Although the 3rd day had ended, it looked as though the barrier would still persist for a while, which made sense since it was just an imprecise estimate. But just now, it had suddenly blinked out, a huge change from the previous steady decline. They immediately sent out their orders, preparing their armors to attack, but that was when something shocking happened. 8 figures. No, 9 figures charged past the second line of defense, rushing toward the first line the invaders had been using at their headquarters. They were erratic and hard to track, moving at a speed so impossibly fast that it seemed as though they were practically shuttling through the bounds of reality. Lionel felt a power booming through his body that he had never touched upon before. However, he knew that it was nothing more than an illusion. What wasn't an illusion, though? Were the 8 ancestors under his control? Lionel appeared high in the skies above the base the cloud race called home. He didn't seem to have the disposition a 6th-dimensional youth should have. And why should he? He raised his hand high into the skies. At that moment, something odd happened. It was as though the shadows of the 8 ancestors that were nowhere near him stacked atop of his own, appearing as illusions to his back. Linked armors worked best when the people using them were of one mind, but there would always be flaws. That said, what if the links were formed between a man and the souls under his control? Wouldn't that be a completely infallible link? Lionel roared, pooling the strength of 8 ancestors into the force above his head and lashing out. His palm descended from the skies, covering the whole city. Boom. Chapter 2150. Published at 12th of September, 2023, 5:53 and 43 seconds AM. Chapter 2150. Time. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. A raging torrent of energy fell like the collapse of a mountain. It was sudden and ferocious, barbaric and uncontrolled. It was as though Lionel had released this attack, venting out everything in his chest all at once. The savage grin on his face practically rose from the depths of hell, an abyssal sort of unbridled darkness spilling over. The crimson within his irises threatened to spill over. The balance was entirely broken. Hundreds of thousands of Cloud Race members died all at once, falling in droves. They didn't even understand how it was that they had died before it was too late, and never could any of them had thought that it would happen at the hands of a 6th-dimensional expert. 8th-dimensional experts weren't supposed to make moves easily. This sort of change could lead to terrible losses on all sides. But what could be done if a 6th-dimensional expert seemed to have suddenly gained the strength of an 8th-dimensional one? The ancestors of the Cloud Race rushed out all at once. They seemed to be the only ones that could withstand such an attack without dying directly. Their faces were all contorted in shock and horror. Even for an ancestor, causing this amount of damage wasn't a simple matter. In 0 VLUSB, C0M they wanted to lash out. But when they saw that the one that stood before them was actually Lionel, their hearts lurched. What was going on? How could a sixth-dimensional expert have such strength? It didn't make any sense. However, there was no time to worry about such matters. They rushed forward, trying to target Lionel and kill him as swiftly as possible. But just when they thought that they had succeeded, Lionel suddenly vanished. The nomad race had no idea what had just happened. Just a moment ago, an ancestor had appeared in the skies above the encampments they had formed. But the oddity was that this ancestor wasn't a member of their race, and was instead the majestic vulture ancestor. The beast domain ancestor had never communicated which of their ancestors had fallen, so the first assumption was that the beasts had something to communicate with them. The nomad ancestors appeared one after another, prepared to receive a message. But just when they had, the majestic vulture ancestor vanished. Before the nomad race could react, Lionel had appeared, but compared to the beast ancestor, he wasn't even a tenth as large, his body vanishing and appearing above the city. A roar escaped his lips as he struck down with all his might. Boom! He didn't have any regard for life. After luring the ancestors out, the number remaining that could resist his strike plummeted. Whereas the cloud race had lost hundreds of thousands to his singular strike, the nomad race lost millions. The devastation could only be described as carnage, the destruction leaving only blood, flesh and ruins behind. The nomad race ancestors were so stunned that they couldn't even react properly. What had just happened? However, before they could do anything, Lionel had already vanished once again. The void battlefield was an impossible large place. Even with the starships, it took several minutes to hours to cross from one location to another. But the current Lionel treated it like a playpen. He skipped from location to location, leaving death in his wake. He toyed with the invading races as though they were nothing more than children before a wild beast. In just a few hours, he had killed more than the total number that had fallen in several days all on his own. The gap between him and the rest of his generation seemed to only be growing wider and wider. In fact, it seemed that even those in elder generations couldn't hope to compare to him. The nomad race, the cloud race, the dwarven race, and the beast races found themselves unable to retaliate. Eventually, they saw nothing but red. There was only one way in their minds to deal with Lionel, and that was to unleash the devastation he had unleashed upon their races against the human race. Since the rules of the eighth-dimensional expert seemed to have been ignored, they would ignore them as well. They wanted to see what Lionel's face would look like whenever everything he had been protecting was razed to the ground. Their fury rose up to their heads as they directly abandoned the seventh-dimensional experts of their races without a care, shooting toward the second line of defense again with their greatest speed. Each and every single one of them with nothing more than murder on their minds. The only one that didn't seem to react like this was Ancestor Barrows. Looking toward his dead clansmen, he felt heavy of heart, and he commanded a full retreat. He didn't know just how much he would appreciate this decision in the future. Lionel suddenly appeared high in the skies of the second line, breathing heavily. His body couldn't handle the influx of so much energy. He was using the materials that he had absorbed as a proxy, but even then he didn't want it to wear out too fast, so most of the energy he had taken control of was used externally, placing a great deal of pressure on his mind and draining his dream force at an extreme pace. Even so, the brightness in his gaze didn't diminish in the slightest. He had already known that these invaders would react like this. They felt humiliated. A sixth-dimension expert was leading them by the nose and forcing them to suffer losses they maybe never had in their entire lives. However, Lionel didn't care about their feelings. All he cared about was making a point. He suddenly flipped a palm, revealing the trembling body of his spear. All this time, in order to limit the amount of drain his mind experienced, he had only used the simplest attacks. If he tried to filter so much energy into his real skills, the formation would collapse within a few minutes, which was why he had only used his fists and palms. But now, it was time to see just what he could do. Chapter 2151. Published at 14th of September, 2023, 5:46 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 2151. 7 minutes. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The flying ancestors looked like laser beams streaking across the skies. They moved so fast that the air combusted and space trembled. As Lionel had expected, they had gathered together, forming a pack. Although they could cause more devastation to the humans by separating and attacking all 9 cities at once, this would put their lives in danger. They had already come to understand that Lionel could somehow use the corpses of ancestors to strengthen himself in these few hours. They couldn't risk any more accidents. When they saw that Lionel was waiting ahead of them, their faces almost lit on fire for more reasons than just the combusting air around them. They wished that they could eat this child alive. Not a single one of the races had experienced losses less than 1 billion. For the largest of them, this was at least a 5% loss on their numbers. For the smallest it was already as much as 10%. To lose so much in just a few hours was completely unacceptable. This boy needed to die. They didn't care if he was relying on someone else to do all of this. They didn't care if he was just a figurehead used in an attempt to humiliate them. Both things they believed in their hearts to be the truth. All they cared about right this moment was crushing Lionel, and forcing whoever was at his back to come out so they could crush them as well with their full force. That was right. They had come all together like this not only out of caution toward what other tricks Lionel might have up his sleeves, but also because they felt that once they targeted Lionel like this, they might accidentally trigger the final stages of the battle. In such a situation, they would crush the ancestors of the human race with all their might. However, even after they closed the distance to just a few dozen kilometers, nothing more than a few seconds to the likes of them, there was still only Lionel, standing in the skies with his spear pointed toward the ground. He seemed to be completely focused. He didn't manifest his divine armor, because he knew it couldn't withstand the kind of strength coursing through his body at the moment. But the rush of force didn't stop. His hair fluttered in the wind, his bare torso exposed to the world, covered in sweat, his pants simple and soft, rolled to his calves. He looked like he was in the middle of a training session, rather than about to face off against a legion of dozens of ancestors as a boy of the 6th dimension. Suddenly, when the distance was less than 10 kilometers, his eyes opened. His smile was gone and all that was left was an endless abyss of cold. The sharpness of his blade seemed able to cut the hardest of gems, the howl of his spear force shredding the air around him to pieces. He took a step forward and 8 flashes manifested around him. All 8 ancestors had returned, their auras blazing along with Lionel's. A pride shone within their eyes, as though they felt there was nothing they could do in their lives better than fighting on the same battlefield as Lionel. Lionel's spear trembled and a crisscrossing, hazardous wasteland of spear blades shot through the air. The ancestors who had been charging forward with all the momentum in the world suddenly found themselves having to stop to defend themselves. The strength of this attack was beyond their expectations. 7 minutes, Lionel said lightly, his voice emotionless. The ancestors didn't know what this meant, but Lionel had already moved, his squad of ancestors following to his back. They shot across the skies, intertwining around each other with a tacit understanding. The majestic vulture took the helm, its wings spreading so far and wide that all 8 behind him had been perfectly obscured. Before the ancestors could rely on their internal sight to find the true locations, an orb of darkness, within Lionel as the starting point, suddenly erupted. In the skies, an orb of darkness as large as a small moon appeared. Not even a few seconds after it had formed, a body flew out like a flying meteor. It landed on the ground heavily, and the nomad race ancestor, who owned it, coughed up several mouthfuls of blood. However, just when it seemed that he would be fine, his chest exploded with countless crisscrossing blades. N.O.V.L. USB.CO. And just like that, his body was shredded to pieces, the only thing barely remaining intact being his head and his eyes opened wide to the world. One after another, ancestors were thrown out like ragdolls. The shocking devastation that Lionel had left in his wake, leaving the human domain in silence once again. But while in the past it had been due to Lionel's potential, they now realized just how naive they were. This wasn't just a future monster, this was a monster. This wasn't a young man that was a devastation to the younger generation. He was a devastation to anyone that dared to slight him. The orb of darkness suddenly burst. Lionel appeared drenched in blood, his left arm gone from the shoulder down, and his right leg vanquished from the knee down. All around him, the shattered corpses of his 8 ancestors were struggling to pull themselves together again, but he simply didn't have enough dream force left. Even so, the wild, surging spear force around him didn't seem intent on stopping. Below his feet, a gorgeous force art had taken shape. In direct contrast to the darkness that floated around him, it was bright and untouched by imperfection. It seemed like that star of the world, a sun of worlds, a radiance of the universe, untouchable by even the regulator itself. With his singular arm, he raised his spear, the intent in his eyes as lofty as the skies above. The ancestors couldn't support him at the moment, but it was their momentum that had allowed him to complete his force art. This strength was beyond just 8 ancestors. 7 minutes, Lionel said lightly. The tip of his spear trembled, and the radiance beneath his feet took over the world, swallowing everything in its path. Without hesitation, the ancestors that remained turned, running for their lives. You're tuning in to the Lee May's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.